The bronze ladder scraped against stone as they pulled it up through the narrow opening. Below, in the underground chamber of the Campus Sceleratus, Cornelia pressed her palms against the cold earth walls. Her oil lamp flickered, casting wild shadows that danced like the ghosts of all the Vestals who died before her. The priests above worked in silence, their breathing heavy with the weight of what they were doing. No one spoke. She could hear the soft thud of dirt hitting wood above her head. Each shovelful made the darkness press closer. The lamp flame trembled, and she steadied it with both hands, protecting that small circle of light like she'd once protected Rome's eternal flame. The bread they'd left sat untouched on its plate. The water jug stood full. These provisions weren't mercy, they were part of the ritual, the pretense that Rome didn't execute its holiest women. The crowd outside held its breath. Mothers clutched their daughters close. Men who'd cheered at gladiator fights turned away. Even the soldiers shifted uneasily at their posts. Everyone knew what was happening beneath their feet, but no one dared name it. The scraping stopped. The last wooden plank slid into place. Then came the wet slap of mortar sealing the edges. Cornelia's breathing echoed in the tiny space. The lamp oil would last perhaps 3 days. The air, much less. She touched the rough wool of her stola, still pure white, still marked with the purple stripe of her sacred office. 30 years of perfect service, 30 years of tending Vesta's flame, and it ended here, in this suffocating dark. The mortar dried. The priest's footsteps faded. Above ground, Rome continued its business, already forgetting the woman they'd just buried alive. How does the most honored woman in Rome end up sealed alive beneath the evil field? Why would a civilization that revered its Vestal Virgins devise such a specific, terrifying death? To understand Cornelia's fate, we need to rewind 30 years to the day a 6-year-old girl was chosen by lot to serve the goddess Vesta. We need to trace the path from that bright spring morning to this airless tomb, from childhood innocence to condemned woman. The ivory lots clicked together in the bronze urn as the Pontifex Maximus reached inside. 6 young girls stood in a line before him, their small bodies draped in white togas, their hair still long and unbound. The forum fell silent. Even the merchants stopped hawking their wares. The spring sun caught the priest's golden robes as his fingers closed around a single lot. Cornelia stood third from the left, barely tall enough to see over the ceremonial brazier. Her mother's grip tightened on her shoulder. The other families pressed closer, a wall of held breath and racing hearts. The priest's hand emerged from the urn. He unrolled the ivory piece. The name scratched into its surface would change everything. Cornelia Cossa. Her mother's fingers dug into her skin. Someone behind them sobbed with relief. The other girls' mothers pulled their daughters back, away from the altar, away from the fate that had just claimed someone else's child. But Cornelia's feet stayed rooted to the marble platform. She didn't understand why everyone looked so strange. The priest's smile didn't reach his eyes. They'd explained it to her, of course. How Vesta's priestesses kept Rome safe. How the sacred flame protected the city. How lucky she was to be eligible. Born to a patrician family with both parents still living. They'd dressed her in new clothes that morning. Her father had kissed her forehead. But this honor came with a price no 6-year-old could comprehend. The ceremony moved quickly after that. 2 senior Vestals stepped forward, their faces hidden beneath white veils. They took Cornelia's hands. Her mother tried to follow, but the lictors blocked her path. The rules were absolute. From this moment forward, Cornelia belonged to Vesta. She belonged to Rome. They led her to the house of the Vestals, that palace beside the forum where she'd spend the next 30 years. The building loomed above her, all marble columns and shadowed doorways. Inside, 5 other priestesses waited. The eldest, Oksha, had served for 57 years. Her fingers trembled as she held the ritual shears. "Your hair," Oksha said softly. "We must cut it now." Cornelia's dark curls fell to the floor in soft heaps. Each snip of the bronze shears marked another piece of her childhood falling away. Her neck felt strange and bare. The senior Vestals dressed her in the white stola with its purple border. The wool scratched against her skin. The white stola they dressed her in would become either her glory or her shroud. They explained her new life in simple terms. 10 years to learn the rituals, 10 years to perform them, 10 years to teach the next generation, 30 years total if she kept her vows, if she stayed pure, if the flame never died on her watch. They didn't explain what happened if she failed. Her first night in the Vestal's house, she heard crying from another room. Fabia, only 2 years older, still wept for her mother every evening. The marble halls echoed with the sound. But crying was discouraged. Vestals were supposed to be above such mortal concerns. They were living symbols of Rome's strength. The next morning began her education. She learned to tend the sacred flame, feeding it with special wood, never letting it falter. She memorized the prayers in the old language that even most priests didn't fully understand. She practiced carrying water from the sacred spring, balancing the clay vessels on her hip. Every movement had meaning. Every gesture carried the weight of tradition. The days blurred together. Wake before dawn. Tend the flame. Perform the morning rituals. Study with the senior priestesses. Tend the flame again. More prayers. More ceremonies. Sleep in a narrow bed in a room that smelled of incense and loneliness. As her mother's tears fell, no one mentioned what happened to Vestals who failed. Outside the house of the Vestals, Rome buzzed with life. Cornelia could hear it through the walls, the constant hum of the greatest city in the world. Markets opening, senators arguing, children playing in the streets. But that life wasn't hers anymore. Her world had shrunk to sacred spaces and ancient duties. She learned the privileges too, the best seats at the games, the right to own property, the power to pardon condemned prisoners with a touch. When she walked through the forum, preceded by a lictor, crowds parted before her. Men bowed. Women whispered. She was holy. She was untouchable. She was trapped. Years passed. Her body changed, but her life remained frozen. The same rituals, the same prayers, the same white stola, replaced when it wore thin but always identical. She watched through the windows as Roman girls her age married, had children, built lives full of messy human connection. She tended the flame. Sometimes she remembered that first day, the weight of her mother's hand on her shoulder, the sound of her name emerging from the priest's lips. Sometimes she wondered about the other 5 girls who'd stood beside her. They'd grown up, married, perhaps died in childbirth, or lived to see grandchildren. Their lots had stayed in the urn. The senior Vestals taught her things beyond the rituals. How to read the political currents of Rome. How to use her influence carefully. How to navigate the dangerous waters of imperial favor. They taught her which senators could be trusted, and which would sell their own mothers for power. They taught her to be more than holy. They taught her to survive. But some lessons came too late. They never taught her how to defend against false accusations. They never explained how quickly Rome could turn on its most sacred women. They never warned her that the same crowds who bowed to her in the streets would one day gather to watch her die. The ritual knife that cut her hair that day would pale compared to the blade of accusation that would fall 30 years later. The flame sputtered once, just once, and every Vestal in the temple froze. Cornelia's breath caught in her throat. The sacred fire danced lower, its golden tongues licking desperately at the specially blessed wood. Around her, 5 white-robed figures stood motionless, their faces hidden beneath veils, but she could feel their terror radiating through the smoky air. The bronze brazier that held Rome's eternal flame seemed to shrink before their eyes. More kindling, Oksha commanded, her ancient voice cutting through the paralysis. Quickly. The youngest Vestal, Julia, scrambled for the basket of sacred wood. Her sandals slapped against the marble floor, the sound sharp as breaking bones in the temple's hush. Cornelia moved to the bellows, working them with practiced precision. Air whooshed through the brass tubes. The flame steadied, climbed higher, resumed its eternal dance. They'd saved it. This time, Oksha lowered herself onto a marble bench, her body shaking beneath the wool stola. At 73, she'd tended this flame for 67 years. She'd seen it falter before. She knew what happened when Vesta's fire died completely. "Gather close," she whispered. The other Vestals formed a circle around their eldest sister. "Let me tell you about the year the flame went out." The story came in halting fragments. how the Gauls had breached Rome's walls, how the Vestals had fled with the sacred objects, carrying burning torches from the dying flame, how they'd returned to find the temple sacked, the brazier cold, the fire that had burned since Numa's time reduced to ash. Rome nearly fell that year. Disease followed, famine, death. "The flame is Rome," Oxia said, her milky eyes finding each of them in turn. "When it dies, the city dies with it." Cornelia had been 12 when she first took a night watch alone. The older Vestals showed her how to bank the coals just so, how to read the flame's moods, how to sense when it needed feeding before it showed signs of weakness. They taught her the prayers to whisper in the dark hours. They taught her the fear that came with holding Rome's fate in her young hands. The physical toll started small, burns on her fingers from adjusting the logs, smoke in her lungs that made her cough through morning prayers. The constant exhaustion from broken sleep, always listening for changes in the flame's voice. Her eyes watered continuously. Her white stola carried the permanent scent of sacred smoke, but the mental weight pressed harder. Every crack of settling wood made her heart race. Every shift in the wind that made the flame dance sideways sent ice through her veins. She dreamed of the brazier cold and empty, of Rome burning while Vesta's hearth lay dead. She woke gasping, stumbling to check the flame before her eyes fully opened. The senior Vestals watched her struggle with knowing looks. They'd all been through it. The terror faded to vigilance over time, but it never fully disappeared. Even Oxia, after nearly 7 decades, still jerked awake at unusual sounds from the temple. "You learn to live with it," Fabia told her one night as they shared the watch. "The weight becomes part of you, like your bones or your breath." The flame required specific wood, 9 oak from the sacred grove, cut with bronze axes, dried for exactly 1 year. Each piece had to be inspected for rot or insects. The kindling came from olive branches, blessed and bundled with wool thread. Nothing impure could touch the fire, nothing common could feed it. They worked in shifts, 2 always awake, 2 resting, 2 performing other duties. The schedule never varied. Dawn watch, morning rituals, midday prayers, afternoon duties, evening ceremonies, night vigil. The flame structured their lives down to the heartbeat. During the Feast of Vestalia, the burden intensified. Crowds pressed into the usually forbidden areas of the temple. The flame had to burn brighter, fed constantly to impress the citizens who came to pray. Cornelia's arms ached from carrying wood. Her throat burned from reciting endless prayers. But the flame blazed high and strong, reminding Rome of Vesta's power. She learned to read the omens in the fire's behavior. A blue tinge meant rain coming. Sparks flying eastward warned of trouble from that direction. When the flame burned absolutely still despite the breeze, the Vestals knew important news approached. They documented everything in the secret books, centuries of observations that helped them predict and prevent disasters. The other duties seemed simple by comparison. Drawing water from the sacred spring took strength, but not constant vigilance. Preparing the mola salsa, choosers, the ritual salt cakes, required precision but allowed for conversation. Even cleaning the temple bloodstains after sacrifices felt like relief compared to the endless pressure of the flame watch. Some nights, Cornelia found herself mesmerized by the fire's dance. The way it twisted and leaped reminded her of lives she'd never live. In the orange flickers, she saw wedding torches. In the red heart of the coals, she glimpsed passion she'd never know. The flame that preserved Rome consumed her youth 1 hour at a time. The senior Vestals whispered about predecessors who'd cracked under the strain, Vestals who'd started seeing visions in the smoke, who'd begun talking to the flame like a lover or a child, who'd had to be quietly retired to countryside estates where they could rest their fractured minds. The sacred fire demanded sacrifice beyond the physical wood that fed it. Vesta tests us, Oxia explained during one of their lessons. She chooses only the strongest to guard her hearth. When you feel the weight crushing you, remember, you were chosen. You are capable. Rome trusts you with its very survival. The trust felt heavier than any bronze vessel. When foreign ambassadors visited, they were brought to see the eternal flame, proof of Rome's divine favor, evidence of the gods' continuing protection. The Vestals stood like statues while strangers marveled at the fire that had burned since the city's founding. No one mentioned the burnt fingers hidden beneath pristine sleeves. No one saw the exhaustion painted over with sacred oils and dignity. Years blended together in service to the flame. Cornelia grew from frightened child to competent priestess to senior Vestal. New girls arrived, weeping for their mothers. She taught them as she'd been taught, how to read the flame's needs, how to bear the weight, how to find meaning in the endless repetition of feed, tend, watch, pray. The flame became extension of herself. She knew its voice better than her own, could sense its hunger before it dimmed, could predict its moods by the sound of its crackle. Other Vestals joked that she'd married the fire, but the comparison cut too close to truth. What husband could demand more constant attention? What marriage required greater sacrifice? Political upheavals shook Rome, but the flame burned steady. Emperors rose and fell. Wars raged at the borders. The Vestals maintained their vigil. During the civil conflicts, soldiers from opposing sides would pause their battles to let the Vestals pass with their covered flame vessels. Even in chaos, some things remained sacred. Domitian's rise to power brought new intensity to their duties. The emperor obsessed over religious precision, visiting the temple frequently, questioning their methods, demanding elaborate ceremonies to demonstrate Vesta's favor for his reign. The flame had to burn higher, brighter, more perfectly than ever. Any flicker might be interpreted as divine displeasure with his rule. "He watches us," Julia whispered one night as they changed shifts. "I can feel his eyes even when he's not here." The pressure multiplied. Bad omens reflected on them now. Not just fate. When plague touched the poorest quarters, Domitian questioned whether the Vestals had let the flame burn too low. When floods damaged the grain stores, he wondered aloud if their rituals had been imperfect. The sacred became political. The eternal flame served two masters. Cornelia perfected the art of seeming serene while her mind raced through countless possibilities for disaster. Had that log been properly blessed? Did the morning prayers include every ancient phrase? Was that flutter in the flame divine message or merely wind? The questions circled endlessly while she stood motionless, the perfect image of holy confidence. Late at night, when only she and the flame kept vigil, sometimes she allowed herself to wonder. What would happen if she simply stopped? If she let the fire consume the last log without replacing it? If she watched the coals fade from orange to red to grey to nothing? The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Such power in inaction, such catastrophe in stillness. But morning always came, bringing new wood, new prayers, new weight. The flame danced on. Rome continued. Cornelia fed the fire that fed on her life, each year adding ash to the sacred heap, each decade burning away possibilities she'd never explore. 29 years of perfect service, 29 years of smoke in her lungs and burns on her hands, 29 years of broken sleep and constant fear. The flame never died on her watch. Not once. She'd given everything to keep it burning. The irony would strike her later, in that underground chamber. All those years guarding against the flame's death, and she never considered other fires that could destroy. The flame of rumor, the flame of accusation, the flame of imperial paranoia. The sacred fire still burned strong in Vesta's temple the night they sealed her tomb. Another Vestal fed it now, whispered the same prayers, felt the same weight. The eternal flame would outlive her by centuries. She'd kept her vow to preserve it. The flame would burn steady for 29 years under Cornelia's watch, but it was a different kind of fire that would destroy her. The senator stepped aside as Cornelia passed. His toga brushed the marble column in his haste to clear her path. The law demanded it. Any Roman who failed to yield to a Vestal Virgin faced the executioner's sword. Behind her, 2 lictors marched with ceremonial rods, ready to enforce the ancient privilege. The crowd in the Forum Boreum parted like water before a ship's prow. Power radiated from her white stola, not the crude power of soldiers or the borrowed authority of magistrates. This was older, deeper, woven into Rome's very foundations. She walked through spaces forbidden to other women, entered the Senate house when summoned, spoke words that could overturn death sentences. The purple stripe on her garment outranked the purple of generals. At the games, Her reserved seat overlooked even the emperor's box. Gladiators saluted her before they saluted him. When she stood, 40,000 Romans turned to watch. Her slightest gesture could spare a fallen fighter's life. Thumbs up meant mercy. A covered face meant death. The crowd waited for her judgment before voicing their own bloodlust. The morning after her 20th year of service, a condemned man's mother found Cornelia in the forum. The woman fell to her knees on the rain-slick stones. Her son waited in the Tullianum prison, scheduled for execution at dawn. Highway robbery. The evidence was clear. The sentence was just. But mothers rarely concerned themselves with justice. "Please," the woman gasped. Her fingers clutched at Cornelia's stola. "You have the power. Everyone knows you have the power." The lictors moved to pull her away, but Cornelia raised her hand. Around them, mourning merchants pretended not to watch. A senator paused mid-conversation. Even the street dogs sensed something significant unfolding. The rain drummed against the pavement. The woman's tears mixed with the downpour. Cornelia had pardoned 3 condemned men in her years of service. Each time, the weight of that decision pressed against her ribs, playing goddess with mortal lives. Knowing that mercy shown to one meant mercy denied to their victims. Knowing that her choice echoed through generations. The pardoned man would father children. Those children would impact other lives, all because she decided he should breathe another day. "Describe your son," she said quietly. The woman's words tumbled out between sobs. A good boy led astray. Desperate poverty. A sick sister needing medicine. The usual litany of excuses that might be truth or might be a mother's blindness. Cornelia listened. The rain soaked through her veil. Her attendants shifted nervously. They had morning rituals to perform. The flame to tend. She could feel the senator's eyes boring into her back, watching to see if the Holy Virgin would show weakness, watching for any crack in her divine composure. The moment stretched taut. Then Cornelia touched the woman's shoulder. The gesture was worth more than gold, worth more than armies, worth a life. "Your son will see tomorrow's sunrise," she said, "but only tomorrow's. After that, his fate returns to his own hands." The woman kissed the hem of her stola. Cornelia stepped back, disturbed by the desperate gratitude. She'd changed the course of fate with 5 words, rewritten what the judges had decreed. Even the emperor couldn't overturn a Vestal's pardon. That power should have felt glorious. Instead, it tasted like ash. Marcus Licinius appeared at her elbow as she entered the temple complex. The young senator had been circling for months, bringing small gifts, asking about ritual preparations, making himself useful in ways that bristled with unspoken intent. His perfumed presence made her skin crawl. "A merciful decision," he murmured. "The mother will spread word of your kindness through every tavern in the Subura." Cornelia didn't respond. She'd learned that silence served better than words when dealing with ambitious men. Licinius wanted something. They always wanted something. Access to the sacred books. Influence over her fellow Vestals. A whispered word to sway another priestess's judgment. "The urban praetor mentioned you might need new ceremonial vessels," he continued. "My family's workshops produce the finest bronze in Rome. It would be our honor to donate. The temple accepts no gifts with shadows attached to them." Her voice carried the chill of marble. "Our bronze comes from merchants who seek only fair payment." His jaw tightened. Men like Licinius weren't accustomed to rejection. In any other context he could have pressured her, used his wealth, his connections, his maleness to force compliance. But the white stola changed every equation. She outranked him in the god's eyes. That divine precedence burned worse than any insult. "Of course," he said smoothly, "I merely wish to serve Rome through serving her holiest daughters." She left him standing in the rain. Let him realize that a Vestal's time was worth more than his dignity. Inside the temple complex, her fellow priestesses prepared for the morning rituals. They moved like white shadows through the columned halls, each gesture practiced, each word predetermined. The power they wielded came wrapped in chains of ceremony. Her private chambers overlooked the forum. The room was larger than most Roman houses. Frescoes depicting Vesta's myths covered the walls. The bed was carved from ivory. The clothes chests held enough white wool to outfit a legion. Material wealth accumulated around Vestals like silt in a river bend. Testators included them in wills. Grateful petitioners left offerings. The temple treasury swelled with gold. Fabia found her staring at a gift from last year. A hand mirror of polished silver, its handle shaped like a serpent. The craftsmanship was exquisite. The metal reflected her face with painful clarity. 20 years of smoke had etched fine lines around her eyes. Her hair, shorn short as ritual demanded, showed threads of premature silver. "Admiring your beauty?" Fabia asked. The older Vestal's tone carried gentle mockery. "Careful. Vanity is a short path to longer sins." Cornelia set down the mirror. Its surface clouded immediately. Even silver couldn't maintain its shine in the smoke-filled temple. Everything here tarnished eventually. Metal, marble, women. "Did you ever wonder what you'd look like with long hair?" The question surprised them both. Fabia's expression softened. She touched her own cropped locks. 30 years of monthly cutting had left them coarse as wire. Neither woman could remember the feeling of hair brushing their shoulders. That simple feminine pleasure had been sacrificed along with everything else. "Sometimes I dream about it," Fabia admitted. "Hair down to my waist, braided with flowers for occasions that will never come." They stood in shared silence. Outside, Rome churned with life. Marriages were being negotiated. Children were being conceived. Women their age were teaching daughters to manage households. The city pulsed with connections the Vestals could observe but never join. Their power came from separation, their authority from isolation. A lictor's knock interrupted the moment. The Pontifex Maximus required Cornelia's presence. She straightened her stola, adjusted her veil, transformed back into the untouchable virgin. Fabia watched her go with knowing eyes. Every Vestal perfected that metamorphosis, woman to symbol in the space between heartbeats. The Pontifex waited in his reception hall. Lepidus was new to the position, young for such authority. His ambition showed in every careful gesture. He rose when she entered. Even he must show deference to Vesta's servants. The calculation in his eyes reminded her of Marcus Licinius, men who saw the Vestals as pieces on their political game board. "A delicate matter," he began. "The emperor has concerns about certain interpretations of the sacred texts." Cornelia's spine stiffened. The sacred books belonged to the Vestals alone. Not even the Pontifex could demand access without cause. Domitian's interest in religious matters had grown obsessive lately. He'd renamed months after himself, demanded daily sacrifices. Now his attention turned to mysteries that had remained sealed for centuries. "The texts speak only truth," she said carefully. "Truth requires no interpretation. Yet truth can be selective in its revelation." Lepidus smiled like a snake digesting a mouse. "The emperor wonders if perhaps the Vestals have been too protective of their knowledge, too reluctant to share wisdom that might benefit Rome's stability." Every word carried threat wrapped in silk. Share the secrets or face consequences. Open the books or risk imperial displeasure. The power that protected her could evaporate with a single accusation. Holy virgins remained holy only as long as those in power agreed to see them that way. "Vesta reveals her mysteries to those she chooses," Cornelia replied. "Even emperors cannot compel the goddess." His face darkened. She'd pushed back harder than he expected. The sacred books contained more than rituals. They held records of every emperor's private ceremonies, every secret sacrifice, every divine portent that might support or undermine a reign. Knowledge was power. The Vestals hoarded both. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the goddess would benefit from younger interpretation. Some of the senior Vestals seem inflexible in their readings." The threat crystallized. Replace the older priestesses with young women who could be molded. Girls who would fear imperial power more than divine duty. Cornelia had seen it attempted before. It never ended well. For anyone. She rose without his permission. The breach of protocol made him flinch. Good. Let him remember that she walked where even he couldn't follow. Let him report back to Domitian that the Vestals wouldn't bend easily. The sacred books would remain closed to grasping hands. "Tell the emperor," she said at the doorway, "that Vesta's flames burn hottest when undisturbed." Walking back through the forum, She noticed how many eyes followed her progress, some with reverence, others with calculation, a few with barely concealed resentment. The white stola that elevated her also marked her as target. Every privilege carved another bar in her gilded cage. Every power painted another layer of isolation. That night, she stood before the eternal flame. The bronze brazier reflected her distorted image. In its surface, she looked monstrous, features twisted by curved metal and dancing light. Perhaps that was truth. Perhaps the virgin goddess demanded virgins become something other than human, something harder, something colder, something that could wield divine power without crumbling beneath its weight. The flame flickered, just once, a tiny dip that might have been wind or might have been warning. Cornelia fed it another log. The fire blazed higher. Shadows danced on the temple walls. Each one looked like a reaching hand. Each one grasped for powers that would burn whoever held them. The very rites that elevated her above other Roman women would make her the perfect target for an emperor seeking a scapegoat. Every morning 6 pairs of eyes watched Cornelia dress, checking for any sign of impurity. The attending slaves circled her naked form like carrion birds. Their gazes swept from her shorn scalp to her bare feet, searching for marks, blemishes, anything that might suggest corruption. One held a bronze mirror to catch angles Cornelia couldn't see herself. Another ran fingers through what remained of her hair, checking for lice or signs of disease. The third examined her nails, her teeth, her ears with the thoroughness of a physician preparing a body for burial. Cornelia stood motionless on the cold marble platform, arms extended, breath steady. The morning air raised bumps on her skin, but she didn't shiver. Shivering might be interpreted as guilt. 20 years of these inspections had taught her to become stone while strangers catalogued her flesh. "Turn," the senior attendant commanded. She rotated slowly. The slave's breathing filled the chamber. Behind the lattice screen, she knew a senior Vestal observed the proceedings. Different priestess each day. They watched the watchers. Layers of scrutiny designed to catch any breach before scandal could bloom. The attending slaves would themselves be examined after leaving. Their loyalty was assumed but never trusted. The inspection lasted until the temple bells marked the 2nd hour. Only then could Cornelia lower her arms and accept the white linen they offered. The fabric whispered against her skin. Every morning she wondered which slave might speak against her if pressured, which pair of eyes might claim to have seen something that existed only in imagination or malice. Breakfast came under similar scrutiny. The food taster sampled each dish while 2 priestesses observed, not for poison but for impurities. Wine watered to precise ratios, bread from grain, thrice blessed, olives from trees that had never known blight. A Vestal's body was a temple within the temple. Nothing unclean could enter, nothing suspect could touch the vessel that tended sacred flames. "Sister Claudia requests your presence," a younger Vestal announced from the doorway. Cornelia followed her through corridors where mirrors had been placed at every corner, polished bronze surfaces that caught movement from unexpected angles. The house of the Vestals contained no private spaces, no shadowed alcoves, no door that locked from within. Architecture designed to make secrets impossible. Claudia waited in the garden where sunlight eliminated shadows. 2 other Vestals sat nearby, close enough to witness but far enough to feign privacy. The older woman's face showed the strain of constant vigilance. Dark circles haunted her eyes. Her fingers trembled slightly as she gestured for Cornelia to sit. "There's been talk," Claudia said quietly. The words fell like stones into still water. Cornelia's chest tightened. Talk was how it always started, whispers that grew to murmurs that swelled to accusations. She kept her expression neutral. Even here, even among sisters, showing fear invited suspicion. The other Vestals pretended to examine scrolls while their ears strained for every syllable. "What kind of talk?" "The baker's son claims he saw you smile at him yesterday, when you passed his shop during the procession." Claudia's voice carried no accusation, only weary familiarity. "He's telling anyone who'll listen that the sacred virgin favored him with secret affection." The memory surfaced slowly. The procession to the Regia, crowds pressing close. A child had dropped a honey cake in her path, and she'd stepped carefully around it. Perhaps her lips had curved slightly at the boy's dismay. Perhaps the baker's son had stood nearby and mistaken general kindness for specific interest. Such small things grew monstrous in the retelling. "Should I alter my route?" Cornelia asked. "That might suggest guilt." Claudia rubbed her temples. "Continue as normal. But perhaps arrange your veil more severely. Keep your eyes on the middle distance. Give them nothing to misinterpret." The other Vestals nodded agreement. Each had survived similar whispers. A glance held too long. A word spoken too warmly. A gesture that might mean nothing or everything depending on who watched and what they wanted to see. The sacred virgins lived under Rome's microscope. Every breath was analyzed, every blink catalogued. That afternoon brought the monthly verification. Cornelia entered the examination chamber, where the city's most trusted midwife waited. The woman had performed these checks for 3 decades. Her face showed neither sympathy nor judgment, just professional distance as she gestured toward the draped table. "Lie back, relax if you can." The ceiling fresco depicted Vesta receiving the sacred flame from the gods. Cornelia focused on those painted figures, while hands probed her most intimate places, checking for evidence of penetration, for changes that might indicate pregnancy, for any physical proof that would transform whispers into death sentences. The midwife worked in silence. The attending physician took notes. 2 senior Vestals witnessed from behind a screen. The examination felt eternal, though it lasted mere minutes. When finished, the midwife washed her hands in rosewater. The physician sealed his notes with wax. Another month of verified purity to add to the temple records. Another 30 days before they'd check again, unless someone made specific accusations. Then the examinations would come daily, hourly if suspicion ran hot enough. "All is as it should be," the midwife announced. Cornelia dressed slowly. Her hands shook slightly as she fastened the stoler's pins. Even innocence felt like guilt under such relentless scrutiny. How many Vestals had broken not from impurity but from the constant weight of proving its absence? The human mind could only bear so much watching before it cracked like pottery in a kiln. Evening brought new trials. A senator's wife visited the temple, ostensibly to make offerings, but her eyes followed Cornelia with predatory intensity. The woman had marriageable sons. Any hint of impropriety among the Vestals might elevate her family's prospects. If a priestess fell, someone must replace her. Why not a girl from an ambitious household? "Your complexion seems flushed," the woman observed. "Are you well?" "The sacred flames burn hot today." Cornelia kept her tone level. "As they should when properly tended. Of course, though I've heard heat can inflame more than just bronze braziers." The woman's smile showed too many teeth. "Young women are particularly susceptible to various fevers." Every word was a trap. Agree and admit to physical weakness that might hide moral failings. Disagree and seem defensive. Ignore the comment and appear haughty. Cornelia chose silence, moving to adjust the altar flowers with practiced grace. Let the woman interpret stillness however she wished. The senator's wife left eventually, but her presence lingered like incense smoke. By morning, she'd have spread her observations through half the noble houses. How the Vestal Cornelia had seemed disturbed, how her colour was high, how she'd avoided conversation. Seeds of doubt scattered on fertile ground. Night watches were worst. Alone with the eternal flame, every sound became an accuser. Footsteps in the corridor might be routine patrols or spies gathering evidence. The flames themselves seemed to judge, casting shadows that looked like pointing fingers. During these hours, paranoia felt rational. How could anyone stay pure when purity itself became suspect? Fabia found her there near dawn, feeding logs to the brazier with mechanical precision. "You're trembling," the older Vestal observed. "The morning air is cold." "The morning air has nothing to do with it." Fabia settled beside her. "I heard about the baker's son, and the senator's wife, and the 3 other whispers that started yesterday alone." Cornelia's laugh tasted bitter. "Only 3. I must be losing my touch. This is how it begins." Fabia's voice dropped to barely above breath. "First the whispers, then the watchers, then the formal inquiries. They create the very corruption they claim to prevent. make us so afraid of seeming impure that we act guilty without cause. The truth of it hit like cold water. How many times had Cornelia caught herself overthinking simple actions, calculating how each gesture might be interpreted? The constant surveillance didn't preserve purity, it poisoned it, made every Vestal question herself until doubt became its own sin. Sister Tuccia used to say the only pure virgin was a dead one, Fabia continued. No one could accuse a corpse of impropriety. Tuccia had died 10 years ago. Natural causes, the record said. But Cornelia remembered the hollow look in her eyes those final months, the way she'd stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped fighting the whispers that followed her like shadows. Sometimes surrender looked like illness. Sometimes accusation was a slow poison that left no trace. How do we survive it? Cornelia asked. By remembering that their watching eyes have power only if we grant it. Fabia touched her shoulder gently. Let them observe, let them whisper, let them check and double-check. Our purity isn't found between our legs or in our carefully guarded glances. It lives in the flame we tend, in the rituals we preserve, in the choice we make each dawn to rise and serve despite their suffocating attention. Noble words. Cornelia wanted to believe them, but when morning brought another inspection, another examination, another day of calculated movements and guarded expressions, the weight pressed heavier. The watchers watched, the whisperers whispered, and somewhere in Rome's maze of ambition and paranoia, accusations were being crafted that no amount of verified virginity could deflect. She stood naked on the platform again, while slaves circled and studied. This time she noticed one making notes on a wax tablet. Recording what? The small scar on her knee from childhood? The way morning light caught the fine hair on her arms? Every detail became potential evidence in trials that hadn't started yet. But it wasn't Cornelia's behavior that would condemn her. Rome's failures were mounting like storm clouds on the horizon, and when lightning finally struck, it would seek the highest point to ground itself through sacred flesh. The messenger's sandals slapped against marble as he ran with news of another military disaster. Domitian's face darkened behind his ceremonial mask, the gold reflecting torchlight as another courier stumbled into the throne room. Sweat streaked the man's tunic. Dust from Germanic roads still clung to his legs. The scroll in his trembling hand bore the seal of Legion 21 Rapax, or what remained of it. The Dacians ambushed us at dawn, the messenger gasped. Half the legion, gone. Silence spread through the imperial court like spilled wine. Senators shifted in their seats. The Praetorian guards tightened their grips on spear shafts. Another loss. Another 1,000 Roman soldiers feeding foreign soil with their blood. Another crack in the empire's supposedly invincible shell. The emperor's fingers drummed against his throne's armrest. Each tap echoed through the vast hall. Behind closed doors, the imperial council convened within the hour. Maps covered the table. Red markers showed Roman positions. Black ones marked enemy victories. The black overwhelmed the red like a plague spreading across parchment. Moesia burned. Germania festered. Even Spain whispered rebellion. Perhaps the gods require greater sacrifices, suggested Nerva, ever the traditionalist. We've slaughtered enough bulls to empty Italia's pastures, Domitian snapped. The altars run red daily, yet still we lose. The astrologers huddled in the corner, consulting star charts and sheep entrails. Their faces grew longer with each calculation. The omens spoke clearly. Rome's divine protection wavered. Something fundamental had shifted in the covenant between city and gods. The eternal flame still burned, but did the goddess still listen? History books lined the council chamber walls, and Domitian's advisors pulled them down with desperate hands. They searched for precedent, for patterns, for someone to blame when military might failed. The scrolls told familiar stories. When Brennus and his Gauls had sacked Rome, they'd found the Vestals fleeing with sacred relics. When Hannibal crossed the Alps, 2 Vestals were buried alive to appease the gods. When plague ravaged the legions, a Vestal's impurity was discovered and punished. The pattern is clear, Lepidus murmured, running his finger down a column of dates. Each military disaster, each plague, each famine, each moment when Rome teetered on catastrophe's edge, and beside each entry, a note about the Vestals. Sometimes they'd let the flame falter. Sometimes they'd broken their vows. Sometimes the mere suspicion proved enough. The virgin priestesses served as more than flame keepers. They served as lightning rods for divine wrath. The emperor's eyes glinted in the lamplight as he absorbed this history lesson. "Tell me about the current Vestals," he commanded. "Their years of service, their backgrounds, their reliability." Servants scattered to gather information. Within hours, 6 lives lay dissected on the council table. Oksha, too old and revered to touch. Julia, too young and well-connected. Fabia, whose uncle commanded 3 legions. Licinia, whose family donated grain during the last shortage. Claudia, whose brother served as consul. And Cornelia, 30 years of service, Lepidus noted. Patrician birth, but no powerful relatives. No military connections. No recent public donations. Domitian's finger stopped on her name. Cornelia, clean enough to be above suspicion, isolated enough to lack protection. Perfect. Down in the Subura district, where Rome's poor packed together like salted fish, different whispers spread. The tavern keeper's wife had lost 2 sons in Germania. The baker's daughter waited for news of her husband's legion. The fuller's widow wore black for the 3rd time in 5 years. They gathered at the fountains to share water and grief. Their conversations turned from dead soldiers to dying empire, from military incompetence to divine displeasure. "The gods have turned their faces from us," an old woman croaked. "I've lived through 6 emperors, never seen omens this dark." The younger women nodded. They'd noticed the signs too. Birds flying backwards, wine turning to vinegar in sealed jars, statues weeping what looked like blood but was probably just rust. Still, the accumulation unsettled. When everything went wrong at once, someone had angered heaven. "Remember what happened under Crassus?" Another added. "The Vestals were corrupt. The flame burned low. Parthia swallowed 7 legions. Memory was a dangerous thing in Rome. It connected dots that powerful men preferred scattered. The women remembered their grandmothers' stories, how suspicion had fallen on the temple, how investigations had revealed shocking impurities, how the guilty Vestal's punishment had restored divine favor. Never mind that wars had complex causes. Simple explanations soothed frightened minds. The pattern emerged naturally, without orchestration. When soldiers died, mothers grieved. When mothers grieved, they sought reasons. When reasons stayed hidden, they created them. And who better to blame than women who lived apart, who held privileges, who represented everything ordinary Romans could never touch? By week's end, the whispers had transformed into convictions. At the temple of Vesta, the priestesses felt the atmospheric shift before understanding its source. Offerings decreased. Petitioners approached with strange reluctance. The crowds that usually pressed close during public ceremonies kept their distance. Children who once waved now stared with suspicious eyes. The reverence remained, but something cold had crept beneath it. "They look at us differently," Julia observed after morning rituals. "Like we're diseased." Oksha's ancient face creased with worry. She'd weathered suspicion before, knew its rhythms, how it built slowly like storm clouds, how it broke suddenly like thunder. The other Vestals had only theoretical knowledge of such dangers. She'd lived through 2 investigations, survived by luck and political connections. Not everyone had been so fortunate. "Keep to your duties," she instructed. "Give them no additional cause for doubt." Easier said than done. Every gesture now carried weight. A stumble during procession might suggest divine disfavor. A cough during prayers could indicate spiritual sickness. The Vestals moved through their routines with mechanical precision, afraid that natural human moments would be interpreted as evidence of corruption. The very effort to appear pure made them seem guilty of something. At the imperial palace, Domitian met privately with his astrologer. The man spread star charts across the marble floor. His calculations covered weeks of observations. The conjunction of Mars and Saturn, the comet that appeared briefly, then vanished, the eclipse that lasted moments too long. Each celestial event pointed toward the same conclusion. The gods demanded payment for Rome's protection. Blood payment, sacred blood. The signs are unmistakable, divine emperor. The covenant must be renewed. Domitian studied the charts he couldn't truly read. Astronomy mattered less than utility. These stellar scribbles gave divine authority to political necessity. Someone must take the blame for military failures. Better a single Vestal than his own leadership. Better ancient ritual than admitting strategic incompetence. Which one? He asked simply. The astrologer hesitated. This went beyond reading stars. This required reading the emperor's intentions. Choosing the wrong name might redirect imperial wrath. But the calculations had already suggested a target. The stars aligned most ominously with someone completing their third decade of service. Someone whose birth chart showed troubling conjunctions. Someone whose name echoed through celestial mathematics. The signs point to Cornelia, he whispered. Neither man smiled, but understanding passed between them. The machinery could begin turning. The investigation would seem organic. The evidence would accumulate naturally. The conclusion would appear inevitable. Rome needed someone to blame for its bleeding borders. The Vestals had served this purpose before. They would serve it again. Lepidus received his instructions that same night. Not written orders, nothing so crude, just a conversation about historical precedents, about the importance of religious purity during military crisis, about how previous pontiffs had saved Rome through vigilant investigation. The meaning crystallized without explicit statement. Find something, create something, save the empire through sacred scandal. He began gathering testimonies the next morning. The baker's son, who'd claimed Cornelia, smiled at him. The senator's wife, who'd noticed her flushed complexion. Guards who might have seen suspicious movements. Slaves who could be persuaded to remember odd behaviors. None of it would stand in honest court. But religious trials followed different rules. Suspicion weighed as heavy as proof. Whispers accumulated into avalanches. Tell me again about the smile. Lepidus pressed the baker's son. Did she look directly at you? Did her lips part? Did she pause in her walking? The boy squirmed. His original boast had been tavern talk, impressing friends with imagined conquest. Now important men in expensive togas demanded details he'd never noticed. But refusing to cooperate carried its own dangers. So he embellished, added specifics, created memories to fill their expectations. She definitely looked at me, right at me. Her eyes, they held promises. Lepidus noted every word. By the time he finished, a meaningless moment had transformed into damning evidence. The boy left confused but rewarded. Gold coins bought many things in Rome. Memory was cheapest of all. Similar scenes played throughout the city. Each interview added another stone to the wall building around Cornelia. No single piece proved anything. Together they painted a portrait of subtle corruption. A Vestal who smiled too often, who walked too quickly, who breathed too deeply, who existed too humanly. The accumulation mattered more than accuracy. Back at the temple, Cornelia noticed the servants watching her differently. The slaves who'd attended her for years now averted their eyes. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. The morning inspections stretched longer. The examinations grew more invasive. Something had shifted in Rome's machinery. She could hear its gears grinding, feel its weight tilting toward her. But understanding the mechanism didn't mean she could stop it. Fabia found her in the garden after sunset, staring at nothing. They're building something, Cornelia said quietly. I can feel it growing, like a tumor in the city's belly. Her sister Vestal didn't deny it, couldn't comfort with false promises. They both knew how these things progressed, how whispers became accusations, how accusations became trials, how trials became processions to the Campus Sceleratus. The only uncertainty was timing. Days, weeks, the machinery ground at its own pace. We could appeal to sympathetic senators, Fabia suggested without conviction. With what? Protests of innocence? They all protest innocence. Cornelia's laugh carried no humor. Even the guilty ones. Especially the guilty ones. The next morning brought news of another military disaster. Pirates had burned the grain fleet. Food prices would triple. Riots would follow. The empire bled from 1,000 cuts and needed bandages. Sacred bandages, scapegoat bandages. Someone must pay for Rome's failures. Someone always did. Domitian walked the palace walls that night. staring toward the temple of Vesta. The eternal flame flickered in its brazier, visible even from this distance. That light had burned since Numa's time, through wars and plagues, through kings and republics and empires. The flame endured, but the women who tended it, they were expendable, replaceable, useful in their sacrifice. His herald would visit the temple tomorrow. The formal investigation would begin. Evidence would emerge with suspicious speed. Witnesses would remember things they'd forgotten. Documents would surface. Slaves would confess knowledge. The machinery would grind forward, crushing whoever stood in its path. The emperor allowed himself one moment of doubt. Cornelia had served faithfully for 30 years. No scandal had touched her. No impropriety stained her record. But that made her perfect for this purpose. The shock would be greater. The lesson clearer. If even the most faithful could harbor corruption, everyone must increase their vigilance. Everyone must prove their loyalty. Everyone must fear. When the emperor's herald appeared at the temple doors, every Vestal knew someone would not survive the week. The bronze doors of the temple crashed open at dawn, an hour when no man should enter. The sound shattered the morning stillness like a hammer striking glass. 20 armed lictors filed through the sacred threshold, their ceremonial axes catching the first light. Behind them walked Lepidus, the Pontifex Maximus, his face arranged in careful lines of religious duty, his purple-bordered toga dragged across stones that had known only women's feet for centuries. Cornelia stood at the altar, frozen in the middle of the dawn prayer. The sacred flame danced between her and the intruders, casting wild shadows that made the lictors seem monstrous. Around her, 5 white-robed figures backed away from the violation. Their breath misted in the cold air. No one spoke. The only sound was leather sandals grinding against marble and the nervous shift of bronze armor. "Cornelia Cossa," Lepidus intoned. His voice filled the temple like smoke. She didn't turn, couldn't turn. Her hand still held the ritual vessel, water sloshing gently against clay. The morning offering remained incomplete. The goddess waited. But men with axes stood where men should never stand, and their presence changed everything. "You will answer charges brought before the sacred college," he continued. "Charges of impurity, of corruption, of breaking vows sworn before gods and Rome." The vessel slipped from her fingers. Clay shattered against marble, water spreading in dark veins across the floor. The sound echoed through the temple, sharp, final, irreversible. Behind her, Julia gasped. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else began to sob. Cornelia finally turned. The Pontifex wouldn't meet her eyes. His gaze fixed somewhere over her left shoulder, as if looking directly at her might reveal his shame. The lictors formed a semicircle, blocking any escape. Not that she would run. Where could a Vestal flee? Her whole world existed within these walls. What charges? Her voice came out steady. 30 years of ritual recitation had taught her to speak through any emotion. Lepidus unrolled a scroll. The parchment crackled like flames. His hands trembled slightly. Fear or excitement? She couldn't tell. The list began with small things. Smiling at the baker's son. Walking too quickly through the forum. Breathing heavily during ceremonies. Each accusation built upon the last. A tower of trivialities reaching toward damnation. Furthermore, he read, "Witnesses report seeing you leave your chamber during sacred hours. Guards testify to hearing suspicious sounds. Slaves confess knowledge of corruption they dare not name aloud. Lies, every word a lie, but she could see how they'd been constructed, each grain of truth twisted just enough. The baker's son had existed. She had walked through the forum. Everything else grew from those seeds like poisonous vines. The other Vestals pressed against the far wall. She could feel their terror radiating across the space. Association meant suspicion. Sympathy equaled guilt. Already they calculated the distance needed to survive. "These are accusations," Cornelia said, "not proof. The proof will emerge at trial." Lepidus rolled the scroll with deliberate slowness. "You will remain under guard until then. Your duties pass to others. Your chambers will be searched. Your testimony will be encouraged." That last word carried weights she didn't want to examine. Encouraged. Rome had many ways to encourage truth from reluctant tongues. Even Vestals weren't immune to persuasion's sharper edges. The sacred body could be violated in the name of preserving sanctity. Oksha should oversee the flame, she said. Practical matters helped steady her voice. Julia knows the morning rituals, the festival preparations. We'll continue without you. Lepidus gestured to the lictors. Take her. They moved with reluctant purpose. These men had daughters. Some probably had sisters who'd stood for selection, who'd escaped the lots by chance. Now they laid hands on a woman they'd bowed to yesterday. Their fingers closed around her arms. Their touch burned through the white wool. Everything burned. The shame of it. The violation. The knowledge that this was only beginning. As they led her past her sisters, Fabia stepped forward. Just one step. Enough to show courage. Not enough to invite retaliation. Their eyes met across the violated space. A lifetime of shared service condensed into that glance. Then Fabia looked away. Had to look away. Survival demanded distance. The forum had filled with early merchants when they emerged. Word spread faster than running water in Rome. Crowds gathered to watch the impossible scene. A Vestal Virgin dragged through streets like a common criminal. Her white stola caught morning light, making her seem to glow against the soldiers' dark presence. Women pulled children back. Men removed their caps in confused respect. The normal rhythms of commerce stuttered to a halt. Shame, someone whispered. But shame on whom? The word hung in the air without clear target. Shame on her for whatever sin she'd committed? Shame on Rome for treating its holy daughter this way? The crowd couldn't decide. They watched in silence as the procession passed. Some made signs against evil. Others touched their hearts in blessing. Most simply stared. The state prison loomed ahead, its stone walls stained with centuries of misery. They wouldn't put her with common criminals. A special chamber waited. Clean, isolated, honorable in its dishonor. But still a cage. Still a place where white wool would grey against dirty stones. Inside, the jailer avoided her eyes as he opened the cell. The space was larger than expected. A proper bed instead of straw. A water basin that looked recently cleaned. Even a small window set high in the wall. Accommodation for her status. Prison for a priestess who wasn't quite prisoner yet. The door closed with bronze finality. The lock turned. Footsteps faded. Silence descended like a burial shroud. Cornelia stood in the center of her cell, arms wrapped around herself. Through the window she could see a slice of sky. Clouds gathered on the horizon. Storm coming. The gods would weep or laugh at the irony. After 30 years of tending their flame, she couldn't tell the difference anymore. Outside, Rome churned with rumors. The baker's son found himself suddenly popular. His story grew with each telling. The smile became a leer. The glance became an invitation. By nightfall, he'd have her throwing herself at his feet. Memory was clay in skilled hands. It shaped itself to match the sculptor's needs. More witnesses emerged hourly. A vegetable seller who'd noticed her breathing. A guard who'd seen shadows where shadows shouldn't be. A slave who'd overheard whispers that might mean anything. Each testimony added weight to the case. Truth mattered less than accumulation. In the temple, the remaining Vestals performed their duties in numb silence. The sacred flame burned on, tended by shaking hands. But something had shifted in the air. The sanctuary felt violated. The rituals felt hollow. They moved through the motions, wondering which of them would be next, wondering if innocence had ever protected anyone. Domitian received updates throughout the day. Each report confirmed what he'd orchestrated. The machinery ground forward, exactly as designed. Public shock. Private relief that someone else bore blame. The perfect scapegoat, tethered and ready for sacrifice. The people need to see justice, he told his council. Swift, decisive, memorable. No one asked what justice meant when the verdict was predetermined. No one questioned why this particular Vestal at this particular moment. The empire bled. Someone must pay. The mathematics of power demanded balance. In her cell, Cornelia heard the storm break. Rain hammered against stones. Thunder shook the walls. but she sat perfectly still on her narrow bed, hands folded in her lap. The guard who brought her evening meal found her like that. He set down the tray and fled without speaking. Her stillness unnerved him more than tears would have. Night brought new sounds. Other prisoners screaming, guards laughing, rats scratching in the walls. The symphony of incarceration. But loudest was the silence where prayer should be. For 30 years she'd whispered to Vesta in the darkness. Now the words wouldn't come. How did one pray to the goddess who'd allowed this? How did one keep faith when faith had failed to keep her? The man who accused her had never even seen her face until the soldiers dragged her past his shop. He'd built his story from glimpses and gossip, weaving fiction from fragments. But fiction served when truth disappointed. His lies would buy favor. Her truth would buy nothing. The proof they presented would have been laughable if it weren't lethal. Shadows and whispers and meanings twisted from innocent moments. A lifetime of perfect service, undone by manufactured suspicions. The crowd that had bowed to her yesterday would cheer her sentence tomorrow. Her sister Vestal's backed away. Association meant suspicion, and survival demanded distance. She understood, would have done the same. The arithmetic of self-preservation allowed no room for loyalty. They would testify to her good character if asked. They would also note any oddness, any moment that might support the narrative. They would survive. She would not. Dawn would bring the trial. The sacred college would gather. Evidence would be presented with solemn ceremony. Witnesses would speak their coached truths. The verdict would fall like a hammer on bronze. Everyone knew the outcome. The only surprise would be the method. The trial would be a formality, but the method of execution had been decided 1,000 years ago when the first Vestal broke her vows, and Rome discovered that even sacred blood could be spilled in sacred ways. The College of Pontifices filed in wearing black, the verdict written on their faces. Their sandals scraped against the basilica floor in perfect unison. 15 priests moving like a funeral procession through the morning light. Each man clutched a voting tablet against his chest. The wax surfaces caught sunlight streaming through the high windows, blank rectangles that would soon carry death. Behind them came the sacred scribes, the witnesses, the guards with ceremonial spears. The machinery of religious justice assembled itself piece by grinding piece. Cornelia stood in the center of the floor, her white stola stark against the dark marble. They'd left her hands unbound, a small dignity for a priestess who still technically served the goddess. 2 lictors flanked her at arm's length, close enough to seize her if she tried to run, far enough to avoid the contamination of touch. The space around her felt cold despite the summer heat pressing against the walls. The witnesses lined up along the eastern wall like actors waiting for their cues. She recognized some faces. The baker's son fidgeted with his tunic hem, his eyes darting everywhere except toward her. A guard she'd passed daily for 20 years studied his feet. 3 slaves she'd never seen before whispered among themselves, practicing testimony they'd been taught. The accumulation of lies given human form. Lepidus took his position at the raised platform. The Pontifex Maximus arranged his purple-bordered toga with theatrical precision. Every fold calculated, every gesture rehearsed. He'd performed this role before with other Vestals, other accusations, other predetermined endings. The bronze scales of justice sat beside him, both plates empty. They wouldn't be needed. Justice had already been weighed in private chambers. "We gather to examine the purity of one who claimed to serve," he began. His voice filled the vast space, echoing off columns older than memory. "To determine if corruption has poisoned the sacred flame, to protect Rome from divine anger through earthly action." The priests settled onto their benches. Some kept their eyes forward. Others stole glances at Cornelia, searching her face for guilt or innocence or whatever would confirm their decision. She gave them nothing. 30 years of ritual had taught her to wear her face like a mask. Emotion was luxury she couldn't afford. Not here. Not now. The first witness approached the speaking stone. The baker's son had dressed in his finest tunic, the wool still creased from storage. His father probably beat him for destroying it with nervous sweat. Dark stains already spread beneath his arms. His voice cracked on the opening words of his testimony. "I saw her look at me," he stammered. Direct, wanting. Her lips moved like she might speak. "Demonstrate," Lepidus commanded. The boy's attempt at recreating Cornelia's supposed expression would have been comic in any other setting. His features contorted into something between a grimace and a leer. Several priests shifted uncomfortably. The parody of desire on his young face made everyone remember she'd served longer than he'd been alive. But discomfort wouldn't change votes already cast in their minds. "How long did this look last?" Lepidus pressed. "Eternity," the boy said. Then, catching himself, "I mean, several heartbeats. Maybe 10. 10 heartbeats." Cornelia remembered that morning. The procession to the Regia. The press of crowds. A child dropping something sticky in her path. She'd stepped around it, perhaps glanced at the source of the commotion. Less than breathing. Less than nothing. Now, stretched into eternity by a boy seeking attention and finding destruction instead. More witnesses followed. Each testimony built on the last like bricks in a wall. The guard who'd seen her walk too quickly, surely a sign of guilty conscience. The senator's wife who'd noticed her flushed complexion, evidence of impure thoughts. A slave who'd overheard her speaking in her sleep. Though he couldn't recall the words, they'd sounded passionate. "Passionate," Lepidus repeated. The word hung in the air like incense. Describe this passion. The slave squirmed. He was perhaps 40, old enough to know the game but not powerful enough to refuse playing. His testimony had been purchased or coerced. The exact method didn't matter. He spoke his lines with the mechanical precision of a prayer learned by rote. Like someone in the throes of feeling, he managed. The kind of sounds that suggest dreams of improper things. No one asked how he'd been close enough to hear a Vestal sleeping. No one questioned why he'd waited until now to report such damning evidence. The priests absorbed each word without challenge. They weren't here to investigate. They were here to ratify. Then came the surprise witness. A man Cornelia had never seen before, young and well-dressed, with the bearing of minor nobility. He approached the speaking stone with confident steps. Unlike the others, he seemed to relish his moment. His testimony would be the blade that cut deepest. "My name is Marcus Caecilius," he announced, "and I must confess my shame." The basilica fell silent. Even the dust motes seemed to pause in their dance through the light. Confession implied participation. Participation meant Cornelia hadn't sinned alone. The priests leaned forward. This was what they'd been waiting for. Not just accusation, but admission. "I loved her," Marcus continued. His voice carried across the space with practiced clarity. "From afar, as one might love the moon. But love corrupts even at distance. I sent her gifts, poems, declarations of feeling that I now realize poisoned her sacred duty." Cornelia's mask finally cracked. She'd never seen this man, never received gifts or poems or anything beyond the official offerings left at the temple. But his performance was flawless. The tremor in his voice, the way his hands shook as he spoke. Anyone watching would believe his pain was real. Maybe he believed it himself. Maybe the fiction had become truth in his mind. "Did she respond?" Lepidus asked. The question sounded casual but carried executioner's weight. "Never directly," Marcus said. "But I knew. The way she arranged the altar flowers after receiving my tokens. The pattern spoke what words couldn't. She was trapped by duty, but her heart answered. Brilliant. Unprovable. Using the very rituals she'd performed for decades as evidence of corruption. Every flower arrangement now suspect. Every gesture potentially coded message. The lie was perfect because it couldn't be refuted. How did one prove that randomly placed lilies weren't love letters? The other priests exchanged meaningful looks. This was what they'd needed. Not just suspicion but story. Not just broken vows but romance twisted into religious violation. The public would understand this narrative. A Vestal tempted by forbidden love. A man driven mad by impossible desire. A tragedy that demanded divine justice. "I tried to stop," Marcus continued. "Tried to forget. But how does one forget the sun? I followed her during public ceremonies. Watched from the crowd. Living on glimpses of white wool and sacred purpose, I corrupted her simply by existing. Simply by feeling what no man should feel for Vesta's daughter. The words poured out like rehearsed poetry, which they probably were. Someone had crafted this testimony with artist's care, each phrase calculated for maximum impact, each pause designed to let the implications sink deeper. Marcus played his part perfectly, the reformed sinner confessing to save his soul and damn hers. When did these gifts begin? Lepidus prompted. 3 years ago, the Feast of Ceres. I saw her carrying the sacred vessels and knew I was lost. 3 years. Long enough to establish pattern, recent enough that witnesses might claim to remember signs. The time frame had been chosen carefully, like everything else in this performance. Marcus described each gift in detail. Roses left at the temple gates, verses slipped between offering plates, a golden bracelet that surely found its way to her chamber. All fantasy, all believed because the believing had been decided before he opened his mouth. Cornelia wanted to laugh, or scream, or demand they produce these phantom gifts. But silence served better than protest. Let them weave their fiction. Let them build their case from shadows and lies. The verdict had been written before she entered this hall. These testimonies were just theatre for public consumption. The sacred scribes recorded every word. Their styluses scratched against wax tablets, preserving the lies for history. Future generations would read this record and think they understood. A Vestal corrupted by love, an empire saved by her sacrifice. The truth would die with her, buried beneath layers of convenient fiction. Marcus finished his performance and stepped back. Several priests wiped their eyes, moved by his pain, impressed by his courage in confessing. No one questioned why he'd waited until now, why he'd chosen this moment to unburden his soul. The timing was too perfect to be anything but orchestrated, but perfect timing served when the empire needed scapegoats. "Are there more witnesses?" Lepidus asked. There were. They lined up to add their stones to the avalanche. A merchant who'd sold her fabric that seemed too fine for religious use. A temple servant who'd noticed her humming, surely love songs disguised as hymns. Each testimony more ridiculous than the last. But ridicule didn't matter when the judges had already chosen guilt. The sun climbed higher, the basilica grew stifling. Sweat ran down Cornelia's back beneath the white wool, but she stood straight, silent, giving them nothing to interpret as admission or denial. Let them exhaust their lies. Let them empty their quiver of accusations. The ending would be the same, regardless. Finally the witnesses ended. Lepidus turned to the assembled priests. His expression suggested deep contemplation of evidence. Another performance. They'd discussed this in private chambers, weighed political necessity against religious law, found the balance that served Domitian's needs. "Before we render judgment," he said slowly, "the accused may speak, if she wishes." The basilica held its breath. Would she defend herself? Deny the charges? Beg for mercy? The scribes readied fresh tablets. The priests straightened on their benches. Even the guards shifted to hear better. This was the moment where the condemned either maintained dignity or shattered completely. Cornelia lifted her chin, met Lepidus's eyes directly. He flinched at the contact but couldn't look away. When she spoke, her voice carried the same clarity she'd used for 30 years of prayers. Clear, strong, absolutely empty of fear. "When you find the gifts Marcus claims he sent," she said, "bring them to my tomb. I would like to see these poems that moved my heart, these roses I never smelled, this bracelet I never wore. Let the earth above me know what fiction looks like. Let the darkness learn the shape of lies." The words landed like stones in still water. Several priests shifted uncomfortably, the naked accusation that they were burying truth along with her. But discomfort wouldn't change their votes. Couldn't change what had been decided before she entered this hall. Lepidus recovered first. "You deny the charges?" "I deny nothing. I confirm nothing. What would be the point? You've gathered your witnesses, heard your evidence. The verdict was written before the first word was spoken. I stand here as ritual demands. Nothing more. One tailed comb. Truth sometimes cuts sharper than any lie. The priests felt it, that slash of honesty through their elaborate performance. But feeling and acting were different things. They had roles to play, sacred duty to perform, even if that duty was dressed in deception. Then we must vote, Lepidus announced. The priests reached for their tablets. The wax surfaces had been smooth when they entered. Now, each would bear a mark, guilty or innocent, death or life. The styluses scratched in unison. 15 separate decisions that would combine into one fate. The sound seemed loud as thunder in the waiting silence. They filed forward to place their tablets in the bronze urn, each vote secret in theory, public in practice. Everyone knew what verdicts served the empire, what decision would appease the gods and excuse the military failures. The tablets dropped one by one, soft thuds like dirt hitting wood. As the final priest cast his vote, Cornelia noticed something. 3 of them had tears on their faces. Real tears. Not the performed emotion of earlier, but genuine grief. They knew they were killing an innocent woman. Knew it and did it anyway. Because knowing and acting were different things in Rome. Because conscience was luxury when the empire demanded sacrifice. Lepidus approached the urn with ceremonial gravity. The count was formality. Everyone knew the outcome. But ritual demanded its completion. He drew out each tablet, made a mark on his tally sheet. The scratching of his stylus seemed to echo off the walls. Once, twice, 15 times. The vote is unanimous, he announced. The Vestal Cornelia is found guilty of breaking her sacred vows. Unanimous. Even those who wept had voted for death. She wondered if that made their tears more honest or more damning. To know truth and choose lie. To see innocence and declare guilt. Perhaps that was the greatest corruption of all. The sentence, Lepidus continued, his voice dropping to near whisper, is what tradition demands. Every Roman knew what tradition demanded for corrupted Vestals. The sentence was exactly what tradition demanded, a death that would leave no blood on Roman hands. They stripped the vitae from her head, the sacred ribbons she'd worn for 30 years. The white bands unraveled slowly, each loop releasing another memory. The day they first wound them through her shorn hair, the weight of them during summer ceremonies, the way they'd pressed against her skull during endless nights of flame-watching. Now the attendant's fingers worked methodically, pulling the wool free strand by strand. 30 years of identity unwinding with each twist of the wrist. The preparation chamber smelled of myrrh and old stone. 4 witnesses stood against the wall. 2 senators, the city prefect, and a scribe to record every detail. Their eyes followed each movement as the temple servants removed the symbols of her office. First the vitae, then the suffibulum, the white veil that had hidden her face from common view. The bronze clips that held it scattered across the floor with sharp final sounds. Outside, hammers rang against wood. The underground chamber at the Campus Sceleratus needed repairs before use. 30 years had passed since the last Vestal died this way. The wooden platforms had rotted. The entrance stones had shifted. Workers scrambled to ready the space while she stood perfectly still, arms extended as they unwound her stola. The purple stripe that marked her as sacred came away in their hands. The shoes, the head attendant murmured. Cornelia lifted one foot, then the other. The red leather slippers slipped off easily. She'd worn variations of them for 3 decades. Soft soles that whispered across temple floors. Now her bare feet touched cold marble. The chill shot through her bones. Every removal took her further from priestess and closer to ordinary woman. Ordinary condemned woman. The workers outside had found something in the chamber. Their voices carried through the window, excited, then hushed. Old bones. Previous occupants who died the same way she would. The ritual demanded they stay. New death piled atop old. The scribe's stylus scratched faster, recording the discovery. Everything must be documented. The precise way tradition unfolded. They brought new clothes. Not the rough garments of common criminals, but a plain white tunic. Clean, simple, free of any marking that would identify her as Vestal. She dressed herself. They wouldn't touch her skin. The fabric felt strange after decades of sacred wool. Lighter, less significant. Already she was disappearing. The chamber preparations? One senator asked. Nearly complete, Excellency. The provisions are being placed now. Provisions. Such a civilized word for what they meant. Bread that would grow mouldy before she could eat it all. Water in a clay jug that would outlast her thirst. milk that would sour in the darkness, a single lamp with oil for perhaps 2 days, the pretense of sustenance. Rome didn't execute Vestals. Rome simply placed them underground with food and light. What happened after was between them and the goddess. Through the window came sounds of pottery being lowered on ropes, the careful placement of each item, the bread wrapped in linen, the water jug wedged where it wouldn't spill. Everything arranged as tradition demanded. The workers knew exactly where each provision belonged. Someone had consulted the old records, found the diagrams, the proper way to stock a tomb for the living. Cornelia's fingers found her throat where the vitae had pressed. The skin felt naked, vulnerable. For 30 years those bands had marked her as untouchable. Now anyone could see her neck. The simple exposure felt more violent than any blow. She forced her hand down, watched it shake slightly before stilling. "Will she walk or be carried?" the prefect asked. Walk or be carried. The last choice she'd make. Some Vestals had collapsed, requiring litters. Others had processed to their deaths with backs straight. The decision mattered. Rome would remember, would whisper about it for generations. Did she go willingly, or did they drag her? Did she maintain dignity, or surrender to terror? "I'll walk." The words came out steady. 2 small syllables that meant she'd give them no additional spectacle. No fainting virgin to titillate the crowds. No struggling woman to justify their punishment. Just footsteps from here to there. From sunlight to darkness. From breathing to not. More sounds from outside. They were testing the platform that would lower her down. Ropes creaking against wood. Male voices counting in unison as they rehearsed the mechanics. Everything must work perfectly. No accidents that might spill blood. No errors that would render the ritual invalid. The goddess demanded precision in sacrifice. The head attendant approached with a final item, a simple wooden comb. She gestured for Cornelia to sit. This wasn't removal but arrangement. Her shorn hair must be neat, presentable. The crowd would examine every detail, would find meaning in how she looked, whether her face showed fear, whether her hands trembled, whether she seemed guilty or innocent or something between. The comb scraped against her scalp. The attendant worked silently, efficiently, neither gentle nor rough, simply performing a task that must be done. Each stroke pulled her remaining hair into order, made her look less wild, less human, more like the symbol they needed her to be. When finished, the woman stepped back without meeting her eyes. Another task complete, another step toward the end. "The procession route?" the prefect asked someone. "Cleared, Excellency. The lictors are positioned. The crowds." The man trailed off. Everyone knew about the crowds, already gathering since dawn, filling the forum, lining the streets. Rome loved its spectacles, and this promised to be memorable. A Vestal Virgin walking to her doom, the white figure against the dark earth, the sacred becoming sacrifice. Incense burned in bronze bowls around the room. The smoke made her eyes water, or perhaps that was something else. She blinked hard, refused to let moisture fall. They watched for any sign of breakdown, any crack in composure. The scribe would note it. History would remember it. She gave them nothing but steady breathing and straight spine. Someone knocked on the door. 3 sharp raps that meant time was running short. The sun climbed toward its zenith. The ceremony must happen at the prescribed hour. When shadows fell, just so. When the goddess's attention was properly aligned, they'd calculated everything. The walk would take 40 minutes. The placement in the chamber another 20. The ceiling perhaps 30 more. All time to conclude before the afternoon prayers. She stood without being told. The movement felt final. Last time rising from a chair. Last time straightening her garment. Last time feeling floor beneath feet that would soon know only earth. The witnesses shifted, prepared to follow, to observe every moment until the very end. Their duty to watch. Hers to be watched. The door opened. Beyond it, a corridor led to sunlight, to crowds, to the slow procession through streets she'd walked for 30 years. Same stones, same buildings, same faces in the windows. But everything changed by context, by destination, by the knowledge that these steps led only one direction. The head attendant made a final adjustment to the plain tunic, smoothed a wrinkle that didn't exist. The gesture seemed almost kind, almost human. Then she stepped away and became another witness, another pair of eyes documenting the ritual, the sacred choreography that would end with earth and darkness. "Ready?" the prefect asked. Ready. Such an impossible question. How could anyone be ready for what came next? But readiness wasn't the point. The schedule was. The tradition. The machinery that had started turning and wouldn't stop until she lay beneath the ground. Ready or not, the procession would begin. The crowds would watch. The chamber would wait. She nodded once. The movement felt heavy, like her head weighed more without the vitae to support it. Tomorrow those ribbons would bind another woman's hair, would mark another as sacred. The office continued even when its holders disappeared. Vesta needed servants. Rome needed symbols. The wheel turned and ground whoever stood in its path. The corridor stretched ahead. Each step would take her closer. Each breath came numbered now. Finite. Precious. Wasted on incense and fear. She moved toward the doorway. Toward the light that would soon be memory. Toward the crowd whose voices already carried on the wind. Tomorrow's procession would be her last journey through the city she'd protected for 3 decades. The funeral cart creaked through streets lined with silent Romans. Its wheels groaned against stones worn smooth by centuries of traffic, each rotation marking another step toward the Campus Sceleratus. The sound echoed off shuttered shops and pressed against the ears of thousands who'd gathered since dawn. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. They all knew what cargo this cart carried. Cornelia sat perfectly still on the wooden bench, her bare feet visible beneath the plain white tunic. The absence of her red leather calcee made citizens gasp and turn away. Those sacred shoes had walked these same streets yesterday. Today, naked flesh touched splintered wood. The contrast struck harder than any accusation. The 2 black horses pulling the cart wore no decorations. Their hooves rang against pavement in funeral rhythm. Behind them, 20 lictors marched with axes reversed, the bronze heads pointing toward earth. The symbolism wasn't subtle. This procession moved backward, life reversing toward death, honor inverting to shame. Children who once threw flowers now hid behind their mothers' skirts. She recognized faces in the crowd. The fruit seller who always saved the best figs for temple offerings. The scribe who copied sacred texts with trembling devotion. The senator's widow who'd wept with gratitude when Cornelia testified on her behalf. Now they all wore the same expression. Horror mixed with fascination. Grief tangled with relief that fate had chosen someone else. The Forum Romanum stretched ahead, its grand columns casting shadows that seemed to reach for the cart. She'd processed through here countless times, leading festivals, blessing marriages, pardoning the condemned. The stones knew her footsteps. The statues had witnessed her dignity. Now they watched her shame. A woman broke from the crowd near the Basilica Julia. Middle-aged, wearing mourning black, her face twisted with rage. The lictors moved to block her, but she screamed over their shoulders. "My son died in Germania while you played with fire. His blood feeds barbarian soil because the gods abandoned us." Spit flew from her lips. Grief had curdled into hatred needing a target. Cornelia met her eyes without flinching. What could she say? That maintaining the eternal flame for 30 years meant nothing if Rome needed someone to blame? That perfect service became worthless when balanced against military failure? The same streets where she'd pardoned criminals now led to her doom. More voices joined the first woman. Not a mob, not yet, but anger building like storm pressure. Accusations flew from the safety of the crowd. She'd smiled too much, walked too proudly, breathed too deeply. Every human moment became evidence of divine displeasure. The cart rolled on through their fury. Near the temple of Castor, she spotted Fabia. Her sister Vestal stood in the shadow of a column, white stola, marking her as sacred. Their eyes met across the space. Fabia's lips moved in what might have been prayer or apology or goodbye. Then she melted back into darkness. Wise. Contact meant contamination. The living couldn't afford association with the condemned. The Pontifex Maximus rode ahead on a white horse. Lepidus sat rigid in his saddle, purple toga arranged to display maximum authority. He never looked back. never acknowledged the woman he'd condemned with unanimous votes. His duty was leading the procession. Hers was following. The mechanics of ritual allowed no deviation. Even hardened soldiers looked away as she passed. The Praetorian guards lining the route kept their eyes fixed forward, men who'd seen battlefields, who'd waded through blood and worse. But this was different. This was watching holiness die slowly, watching civilization eat its own heart. Their discomfort showed in shifted stances and tightened grips on spear shafts. An old man hobbled forward on a crutch, one of the condemned she'd pardoned years ago. He fell to his knees as the cart approached, pressing his forehead to dusty stone. Gratitude and helplessness mingled in the gesture. She'd saved him once. He couldn't save her now. The mathematics of mercy only worked one direction. The cartwheel stuck in a rut near the Regia. The driver cursed softly, whipping the horses. They strained against leather harnesses. The wooden frame groaned. For one impossible moment everything stopped. The procession, the watching crowd, the inexorable march toward darkness. Then the wheels broke free with a lurch that nearly threw her from the bench. Her hands found splinters in the wood. Sharp pain brought strange relief. Physical sensation cutting through numbness. Blood welled from tiny wounds. Red drops on white fabric. The crowd saw it and murmured. First blood drawn. Did that invalidate the ritual? Make the sacrifice impure? The whispers rippled outward, like water disturbed by thrown stones. The driver turned the cart onto the Via Sacra. This road led to only one destination now. The Campus Sceleratus waited at the city's edge. The evil field. Named for the first Vestal buried there centuries ago. How many women had made this same journey? How many had sat where she sat, feeling sun on their faces for the last time? A child's voice pierced the silence. Too young to understand protocol. Too innocent to know fear. Why is the pretty lady crying? Cornelia touched her cheek. Wet. She hadn't noticed tears falling. Couldn't stop them now. The mother hushed her child, but the damage was done. The crowd had seen. The sacred virgin wept. The sight destroyed whatever distance remained between symbol and woman. She was just flesh now. Just fear clothed in white. More children appeared at windows. Faces pressed to shutters. Eyes wide with confusion. Their parents had dressed them in their best clothes. Told them they'd witness history. But this didn't look like the ceremonies they knew. Where was the golden litter? The flower petals? The songs of praise? This looked more like punishment, more like ending. The buildings grew sparser as they moved toward the city's edge. Grand marble gave way to simple brick. Stables became empty lots. Rome thinned out here, civilization fraying at its borders. Beyond the walls lay wilderness, but she wouldn't see it. Her world would end just inside the boundary, close enough to remain Roman, far enough to be forgotten. The cart passed the last temple. Small shrine to Terminus, god of boundaries. Appropriate. She was crossing from one state to another, from living to not quite dead, from honored to erased. The priest at the shrine's entrance raised his hand in blessing or farewell. She couldn't tell which. Maybe they were the same thing now. The crowd thinned but didn't disappear. The most devoted followers, the most curious gawkers, those with strongest stomachs for watching suffering. They maintained respectful distance, but their presence pressed against her back. Witnesses to ensure the ritual completed properly, to carry stories back to those who couldn't bear watching. The pontifex raised his hand. The procession stopped. They'd reached the proper distance from the city centre, close enough for convenience, far enough for concealment. The ground here was softer, easier to dig, easier to forget what lay beneath. The horses snorted and stamped, sensing destination if not understanding purpose. She could smell fresh earth. The work crew had finished their preparations. The scent rose from beyond a small hill, carried on afternoon breeze, soil disturbed after decades of rest. Wood shavings from repaired platforms, the lingering sweetness of myrrh from purification rituals, all mixing into the perfume of prepared burial. The lictors formed a corridor from cart to destination. Their faces stayed carefully blank, professional distance protecting them from what they enabled. She would walk between their axes, follow the path they created. No deviation possible. No escape except forward into darkness. Lepidus dismounted with practiced grace. His attendants rushed to hold his horse, arrange his toga, ensure every detail of appearance remained perfect. He would officiate this final ceremony. Speak the words that transformed execution into sacrifice. Make murder holy through proper pronunciation of ancient phrases. His lips already moved in silent practice. The driver climbed down from his seat, walked to the back of the cart, lowered the wooden gate with surprising gentleness. The hinges squealed. The sound seemed to echo forever. He stepped aside and waited. Everyone waited. For her to move. To take that first step from cart to ground. From transported to walking. From passenger to participant in her own burial. Her legs felt strange. Numb from sitting. Weak from fear. But they held her weight when she stood. The cart rocked slightly. The crowd drew collective breath. She was moving. The final phase beginning. Everything else had been prelude. This was the symphony's last movement. One foot found the ground, then the other. Dust rose around her bare soles. The earth felt warm from afternoon Sunday. Soon she'd know only cold soil. But for now, warmth. For now, connection to the world she'd walked for 30 years. The same earth, the same Sunday. Everything familiar except destination. The lictors shifted formation, created the path she must follow. 20 men with bronze axes forming a corridor of death. She took the first step, then another. Each footfall drummed against packed earth. The sound seemed loud as thunder, or maybe that was her heartbeat, hard to distinguish external from internal anymore. Behind the lictors, the crowd pressed closer. She could hear their breathing, smell their sweat and perfume and fear. They'd come for spectacle and found humanity instead. Found themselves watching someone they'd revered transformed into something they must forget. The cognitive dissonance showed in their faces. How to reconcile the Holy Virgin with the condemned woman. How to understand that they were the same person. Had always been the same person. The procession crested the small hill. Beyond it, the ground fell away into artificial depression. The work crew had done their job well. The entrance gaped like a wound in the earth. Fresh timbers shored the walls. New ropes coiled beside the opening. Everything ready. Everything waiting. The hole in the ground gaped like a mouth, and the ladder descended into darkness that would swallow her whole before the sun touched the horizon. The ladder's rungs felt cold beneath her palms. Each wooden step descended into shadows that grew thicker with every movement downward. Above her, the circle of sky shrank, blue fading to grey, light compressing into memory. The walls pressed close enough to brush her shoulders, earth crumbling in small cascades that caught in her hair. Her foot found the chamber floor, packed dirt, hard as stone from decades of settling. The space opened around her, wider than expected, but low enough that standing straight would mean her head nearly touched the ceiling. They'd carved this room for kneeling, for crouching, for positions that broke the body before death could claim it. The provisions sat arranged on a wooden shelf. 3 loaves of bread wrapped in linen, the clay water jug with its narrow spout, a bowl of milk already gathering flies in the thick air. The oil lamp flickered on its stand, casting shadows that danced like the ghosts of previous occupants. 6 hours of light, perhaps. Then darkness until breath ran out. Above her, the ladder scraped against earth as they pulled it up. The sound rang through the chamber, wood against stone, hope against reality. Lepidus's voice drifted down, beginning the ritual prayers, ancient words in the old language, syllables that transformed murder into divine necessity. She caught fragments between the grinding of timber being positioned over the opening. The lamp flame bent sideways as fresh air rushed through the shrinking gap. Her white tunic fluttered against her legs. The movement felt alive, felt like possibility. Then the first plank slid into place and the breeze died. Another followed. The hammering began, bronze nails driven deep. Each strike reverberated through her chest. The milk had already begun to sour in the chamber's warmth. Its surface filmed over with skin that wrinkled when she lifted the bowl. The smell mixed with earth and fear into something that made her stomach turn. She set it down carefully. No point in spilling. No point in waste. Time would handle both drinking and dying. More planks. More nails. The opening narrowed to a slit of light that let her see hammers rising and falling, work-roughened hands placing each board with precision. She recognized one of the workers. He'd repaired the temple roof last spring. Now he sealed her tomb with the same methodical care. Neither task carried emotion for him, just labor that paid in coin. The prayers grew louder as the light grew thinner. Lepidus called on Vesta to receive her wayward daughter, called on the earth to hold her gently, called on Rome to prosper through this necessary sacrifice. His voice cracked on the final phrases. Performance or genuine emotion, she couldn't tell. Didn't matter. The words accomplished their purpose regardless of feeling behind them. Darkness fell like a door slamming shut when the last plank dropped into place. Total, absolute, the kind of black that made eyes strain for light that didn't exist. She blinked hard. Again. Nothing changed. The lamp still burned somewhere to her left, but its glow seemed swallowed by the pressing dark. She crawled toward it, hands finding rough ground, knees grinding into dirt. The mortar came next. She could hear them mixing it above, the wet slap of water into powder, the scrape of trowels preparing the seal. They would pack every gap, block every possible breach, make certain no sound escaped, no whisper of continued life disturbed the living. The dead should stay properly dead, even when they still breathed. Her fingers found the lamp base. The flame had shrunk during her descent, oil burning faster than expected, or maybe time moved differently in darkness, minutes stretching like hours, hours compressing into heartbeats. She cupped her hands around the light, trying to preserve what warmth remained. The gesture felt futile, felt necessary. The first glop of mortar hit wood with a sound like thick rain. Then more. Steady application filling spaces between planks. She could track their progress by sound, starting at the edges, working inward. Methodical. Thorough. The workers took pride in craft, even when that craft meant sealing tombs. Especially then. Bad work meant hauntings, meant restless spirits, meant guilt that followed home. Her throat felt dry already. The water jug sat somewhere in the blackness, but she didn't reach for it. Not yet. That was admitting the reality of time, of rationing, of calculating how many sips might extend suffering. Better to thirst. Better to let body fail quickly than mind unravel slowly. The mathematics of dying required careful balance. Something scurried across her foot, too quick to identify, too solid to ignore. Of course there would be rats. They found ways into everywhere, through gaps too small for light, through cracks that air could barely pass. They'd been here before her, would remain after. The chamber belonged more to them than her. Above, the voices grew muffled as mortar thickened. She caught her name once, then nothing intelligible, just tones, just rhythm of continued ritual. They would speak over her for the prescribed time, would perform the ceremonies that made this holy rather than horrible, would walk away when tradition released them. Job complete, conscience clear. The lamp sputtered, a gap in the wick or impurity in oil. The flame danced wild for 3 heartbeats, then steadied. But lower, definitely lower. She could see its dimensions now, the rough circle of light it threw, perhaps 2 arm lengths in diameter. Beyond that, walls might be inches or miles away. Darkness had its own geography. Memory intruded with painful clarity. Her first night keeping vigil over Vesta's flame. How the temple's shadows had frightened her. How every sound meant danger to the sacred fire. She'd been 6 years old, terrified of failing. Now she was 36, still surrounded by darkness, still tending a flame that would die too soon. The symmetry felt deliberate, felt like the goddess's final joke. Her knees hurt from kneeling. She shifted position, back finding the wall. The earth felt strangely warm through the tunic, body heat reflected, or imagination providing comfort. She pulled her knees to her chest, made herself small, conserved warmth she didn't need. Habits died harder than bodies. The workers had finished above. Their footsteps faded as they gathered tools and departed. Payment collected, duty discharged. Home to wives who'd ask about their day. To children who'd demand stories. Would they mention the woman they'd buried, or would silence seem kinder? Some tales poisoned the telling. She was alone now, truly alone. No witnesses, no watchers, no one cataloguing her expressions or measuring her purity. The freedom felt strange, felt too late. All those years performing perfection, and now, finally, privacy. She could scream, could rage, could curse every god and emperor who'd brought her here. No one would know. No one would record it in official histories. But silence seemed better, seemed proper. Last dignity in place without dignity. She pressed palms against her eyes, watched colours bloom in the pressure, reds and golds that reminded her of sacred fires, of sunsets, of all the light she'd never see again. The display faded when she released. Darkness rushed back like water finding its level. The bread would last 3 days if she ate carefully. The water perhaps 5. The lamp oil less than 1. She could stretch existence by rationing, could buy hours through suffering, or she could break the bread now. Drink deeply. Let the lamp burn bright until it guttered. Choice still existed even here. Small choice, final choice, but hers to make. A sound filtered through the earth. Muffled, distant. She pressed her ear to the wall and heard it clearly. Wheels on stone, carts passing on the road above, life continuing, commerce flowing. Rome functioning without her, the eternal city eternally indifferent to individual tragedy. Tomorrow the bread sellers would hawk their wares, children would play, lovers would meet, and 6 feet below, she would count breaths in darkness. The lamp flame definitely burned lower now. She could see its decline in how shadows shifted, how the circle of light contracted like a pupil, adjusting to brightness it would never find. Soon she'd need to decide, let it die naturally, or pinch it out herself, control the last moment of sight, or surrender to circumstance. Both options felt like defeat. Her fingers found the bread. The linen wrapping smelled of rosemary. Someone had taken care with this, had selected good loaves, fresh, as if quality mattered when the eating happened in darkness. She unwrapped one slowly. The crust crumbled slightly, still soft inside, still real, still connecting her to the world that baked it. She tore off a small piece, chewed slowly, tasted wheat and salt and something bitter that might be tears. 30 years of sacred meals eaten in marble halls, of feast days and fasting, of appetite controlled and pleasure denied. This common bread in this earthen tomb tasted more real than any ceremonial offering, more honest than sacred cakes. The rat returned, or a different one, hard to tell in darkness. It scurried closer, drawn by bread scent, by signs of life in place of death. She broke off a crumb and tossed it into the black, heard the scramble of tiny feet, the quick gnawing. At least someone would feast, would take sustenance from this tomb. The thought brought strange comfort. Above ground, night would be falling. She could feel it in her bones. In the way air settled heavier, the lamp would burn through darkness into darkness. No sunrise for her. No marking of time except the oil's consumption. The body's slow failure. The mind's gradual acceptance of ending. All of it measured in breaths that already tasted of earth. She closed her eyes. Useless gesture in total black, but eyelids had their own weight, their own purpose. Behind them, she could pretend the darkness was chosen, was temporary, was anything but tons of earth holding her down, pressing her into place, making her part of the ground that would forget her name. The lamp gave a final flutter, oil running thin, wick burning low. She opened her eyes to watch it die. This last small Sunday, this fingernail of light holding back the infinite dark, it danced, dimmed, sparked once more in defiance, then went out with a small sound like a sigh. Darkness crashed in like a physical weight, complete, final, forever. She sat in the newborn black and listened to her heart beating, still strong, still pushing blood through veins that would empty slowly. The human body fought its own ending, demanded breath even when breath brought no hope, demanded life even when life meant only darkness. The cruelty of nature making death harder than it needed to be. Time meant nothing now. Had she been here hours, days? The bread remained. The water waited. Her body continued its stubborn rhythm. but measurement had died with the light. She existed in eternal present tense, no past to remember, no future to fear, just now, just dark, just the weight of earth and expectation. Somewhere above, Rome slept. Somewhere above, the eternal flame burned on under another's care. Somewhere above, they already worked to forget her name, to erase the inconvenience of her innocence. History would record what power needed. Truth would suffocate down here with her. She lay back against the earth. Let it take her weight, take her warmth, take whatever it demanded. The darkness felt patient, had waited 30 years for this embrace, could wait a few days more. She was going nowhere, had nowhere to go. The earth would claim her by degrees, had already started, would finish when breath finally failed. In the absolute black, she thought she saw light, impossible light, memory of flames she'd tended, ghost of sun through temple windows, the mind creating what eyes couldn't find. She reached toward it, found only air, only absence, only the patient darkness that would outlast any hallucination. Above her, 6 feet of earth held its silence. Beyond that, stars she'd never see again. Beyond those, gods who'd abandoned her or never existed. The cosmos spun on without her small light to tend, without her careful hands to feed sacred flames. The universe barely noticed when suns died, would not pause for a priestess. As darkness swallowed Cornelia, Rome itself had signed its own eventual death warrant. The empire that devoured its holiest daughters would find the gods had long memories and longer patience. The bronze ladder scraped against stone as they pulled it up through the narrow opening. Below, in the underground chamber of the Campus Sceleratus, Cornelia pressed her palms against the cold earth walls. Her oil lamp flickered, casting wild shadows that danced like the ghosts of all the Vestals who'd died before her. The priests above worked in silence, their breathing heavy with the weight of what they were doing. No one spoke. She could hear the soft thud of dirt hitting wood above her head. Each shovelful made the darkness press closer. The lamp flame trembled, and she steadied it with both hands, protecting that small circle of light like she'd once protected Rome's eternal flame. The bread they'd left sat untouched on its plate. The water jug stood full. These provisions weren't mercy. They were part of the ritual, the pretense that Rome didn't execute its holiest women. The crowd outside held its breath. Mothers clutched their daughters close. Men who'd cheered at gladiator fights turned away. Even the soldiers shifted uneasily at their posts. Everyone knew what was happening beneath their feet, but no one dared name it. The scraping stopped. The last wooden plank slid into place. Then came the wet slap of mortar sealing the edges. Cornelia's breathing echoed in the tiny space. The lamp oil would last perhaps 3 days. The air, much less. She touched the rough wool of her stola, still pure white, still marked with the purple stripe of her sacred office. 30 years of perfect service, 30 years of tending Vesta's flame, and it ended here in this suffocating dark. The mortar dried. The priest's footsteps faded. Above ground, Rome continued its business, already forgetting the woman they'd just buried alive. The memory crashed over her like ice water, that first dawn when she'd stood before the eternal flame. 6 years old, hands too small for the bronze ladle, voice cracking on the ancient prayers. The senior Vestals had shown her how to bank the coals just so, how to read the fire's hunger before it dimmed, how to whisper the secret names that kept the goddess listening. She'd trembled then, terrified of failing Rome. Now she trembled in darkness, knowing Rome had failed her. The lamp sputtered, oil running low already, or had hours passed? Time meant nothing in the earth's belly. She thought of mornings in the temple, sunlight through marble columns, the smell of fresh bread from the offering tables, Julia's nervous laughter during ceremonies, Fabia's steady presence during night watches. All of it felt centuries distant. All of it felt like yesterday. Her fingers found the water jug, clay smooth and cool. She didn't drink. Not yet. That was surrendering to the body's timeline. She'd controlled appetite for 3 decades. Fasted when ritual demanded. Feasted when ceremony required. This was just another test of discipline. Another way to prove devotion. Even if no one was watching, even if the goddess had turned away, something moved in the darkness beyond the lamp's reach, soft scraping like cloth on stone. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with her terror. Other women had died here. Their bones mixed with the earth that held her. She wondered if they'd screamed, if they'd prayed, if they'd cursed the city that condemned them. The lamp flame bent sideways, though no breeze could penetrate the sealed chamber. 29 years ago, she'd walked through these same streets as a new Vestal. People had thrown rose petals. Fathers had lifted children onto shoulders to see. The whole city had celebrated another pure daughter joining Vesta's service. The memory tasted bitter as the stale air. Those same citizens had watched today, had seen her bare feet on the cart, had heard the nails driving deep, had done nothing. Her knees ached against the packed earth. She shifted position, back finding the wall. Still warm from the day's Sunday. Soon it would cool. Soon everything would cool. The bread would mold. The milk would sour. She would become another layer of corruption in this ancient killing ground. Tomorrow they'd choose a new Vestal to replace her. Some terrified 6-year-old who didn't understand the price. Who'd think the pretty ribbons and special seats meant protection. Who'd learn too late that Rome loved its symbols more than its daughters. The flame definitely burned lower now. She could mark its decline in the shrinking circle of light. Soon, she'd sit in perfect blackness. Would forget what seeing meant, would exist only as breath and heartbeat in the earth's gut. The rats would come then, would take the bread she couldn't eat, would gnaw through wool to find what feast her body offered. She'd join the underground congregation of murdered innocents. Lepidus would sleep well tonight, would tell himself he'd saved Rome. The emperor would find another disaster to blame on someone else. The wheel would turn, another Vestal would smile at the wrong moment, would breathe too deeply, would exist too humanly. The charges would accumulate. The trial would proceed. The cart would creak through silent streets. And here, in this carefully maintained chamber, another woman would count breaths in darkness. She tore off a piece of bread, chewed slowly. It tasted of rosemary and tears. Someone had baked it this morning, had kneaded the dough thinking it would nourish, had added herbs for flavor that only she would taste. Strange kindness in that, strange cruelty. The last meal should be ash, should match the bitterness flooding her throat. Instead, it reminded her of feast days, of plenty, of everything she'd never taste again. The lamp gave a final shudder. The wick curled black. Darkness rushed in like water through a broken dam. Complete. Absolute. The kind of black that made her eyes ache, searching for light that wasn't there. She felt the walls pressing closer, though she knew they hadn't moved. Felt the ceiling lowering, though she still sat upright. The earth wanted to claim her, was already claiming her. Each breath came harder. Each heartbeat echoed louder. Above her, the eternal flame still burned. Another's hands fed it now. Another's voice spoke the dawn prayers. The sacred fire didn't mourn its fallen keeper, didn't flicker in sympathy. It consumed wood and time with the same steady hunger, as if 30 years of her life meant nothing, as if perfect service was just fuel to be burned and forgotten. She thought of her mother, long dead now, but that first day remained sharp as broken pottery. The way her fingers had dug into Cornelia's shoulder, the way her face had crumbled when the priest spoke her daughter's name. She'd known then what the pretty ceremony meant, what price the gods demanded, had spent 6 years preparing to lose her child, had dressed her in white that morning knowing it was funeral garb, had kissed her knowing it was goodbye. Would anyone mourn her, truly mourn beyond the required public displays? Fabia might weep in private, Julia would pour out wine offerings, but grief was dangerous for Vestals. Too much emotion suggested attachment, suggested impurity of thought. They'd learned to bury feelings deeper than Rome buried its embarrassments. She'd become a cautionary tale whispered during training, a reminder to maintain distance, to perform perfection, to give the empire no excuse. The darkness had weight, pressed against her chest, filled her lungs with earth taste. She tried to remember sunlight, tried to summon the feeling of warmth on skin, but memory proved as fragile as lamp flame. Each image dissolved into black, each sensation faded to nothing. Soon she'd forget her own face, would exist only as consciousness trapped in meat, trapped in earth. The philosophers spoke of souls ascending, of divine reunion, but all she felt was the patient hunger of the ground. Her hand found the water jug again, still full, still waiting. She could drink deep, could flood her body with temporary relief, or she could wait, could stretch existence through suffering. Both roads led to the same darkness. The only choice was speed. She left the jug untouched. Some defiance still flickered in her bones. Some need to control the uncontrollable, even if control meant choosing thirst. Time became elastic, stretched and compressed without marker. Had she been here hours, days? The bread hadn't molded, her body hadn't failed, but darkness made its own calendar, measured itself in heartbeats and hallucinations. She thought she heard voices, thought she felt wind, thought she saw her mother reaching through the black. All lies the mind told to avoid accepting truth. She was already dead. The rest was just the body catching up. Everything above ground had moved on, written her out of history, replaced her name with convenient fiction. The records would show a Vestal corrupted by lust, would detail sins she'd never committed, would use her destruction to reinforce the system that destroyed her. Future girls would study her fall, would promise themselves more perfect purity, would learn too late that perfection wasn't protection. The earth waited with infinite patience, had swallowed civilizations, had digested empires. One woman was nothing to its appetite. She felt small as a seed in its belly, felt herself beginning to dissolve into the larger darkness, into the community of bones beneath Rome's foundation, all the inconvenient dead, all the sacrificed daughters, all the women who'd kept faith with gods who kept no faith with them. She lay back, let the earth take her weight, take her warmth. The darkness felt almost gentle now, almost like the wool blankets of childhood, before the temple, before the vows, before she understood that honor could be another word for cage. Her breathing slowed, not from failing air, from acceptance, from the strange peace that came with ending. She'd fought for 30 years, had been perfect, had been nothing. Now she could rest. But rage flickered beneath the peace, small flame in the vast dark. Rage at Lepidus and his convenient evidence, at Domitian and his need for scapegoats, at the citizens who'd watched and done nothing, at the goddess who'd accepted 3 decades of service then allowed this, at herself for believing the promises, for thinking perfect duty meant protection, for loving something that couldn't love her back. The rage felt better than peace, felt like the last honest thing in a world built on lies. She fed it memories, every dawn prayer, every missed meal, every festival where she'd stood separate while families celebrated together, every night watching the flame while life happened elsewhere. All of it fuel for the fury that warmed her better than any lamp. They thought they'd buried her shame, but shame belonged to the living, to the priests who'd voted unanimously for death, to the witnesses who'd spoken false words, to the workers who'd sealed the tomb, to the city that needed innocent blood to excuse its failures. She carried no shame into the darkness, only the clean anger of the betrayed, only the perfect fury of the condemned. Let them live with what they'd done. Let them dream of this chamber. Let them wonder if she'd cursed them with her final breath. The water jug toppled. She must have brushed it reaching through the black. Liquid spread across the floor, found her legs, soaked through linen to chill her skin. Waste. But what wasn't waste here? The bread would rot, her body would rot. Everything ended up feeding the earth's hunger. At least the spilled water marked time, marked space, proved she still existed enough to destroy. She pressed her palms against her eyes, saw colors bloom in the pressure, the only light she'd make now, red and gold spirals that reminded her of sacred flames, of sunsets, of all the beauty she'd never see again. The display faded when she released. Black rushed back hungrier than before, but for a moment she'd made her own stars, had proven darkness wasn't absolute, not while consciousness remained to defy it. Somewhere above, dawn approached. She felt it in her bones, though no light could penetrate. 30 years of pre-dawn rising had carved grooves in her soul. Her body knew the hour, knew she should be moving toward the temple, should be preparing for morning ritual. Instead, she lay in Earth's belly while another spoke her prayers, while another fed her flame, while life continued its patterns without her. The bread had started to change. She could smell it beginning to turn, sweet rot mixing with earth damp, time marking itself in decay. She should eat while it remained edible, should fuel her body for whatever came next. But appetite had died with the light, had joined the growing list of things that didn't matter anymore. Hunger was just another sensation, another way the body clung to existence it couldn't sustain. Her throat felt full of dust, full of words she'd never speak, accusations she'd never voice, curses she'd never cast. They accumulated like sediment, like centuries of silenced women's rage. If she could scream, would anyone hear? Would the earth conduct her fury upward? Would it crack foundations? Would it shake temples? Or would it swallow that too? Add her voice to the underground chorus of the betrayed. The rats had found the bread. She heard them gnawing in the darkness. Tiny lives taking what they could, making feast of her famine. She didn't grudge them. They belonged here more than she did, had made homes in the spaces between graves, had raised generations in the dark. They knew secrets she was only beginning to learn, how to exist without light, how to navigate by smell and sound, how to find sustenance in places meant for death. Her fingers traced patterns on the floor, letters, words, sentences no one would read. She wrote her true story in dust and dampness, wrote the accusations they'd silenced, the innocence they'd buried, the faith they'd betrayed. Her finger moved steady as a stylus, recording truth in the dark, even if wind would erase it, even if time would forget. She'd spent 30 years writing history with smoke and ritual. This felt more permanent, more honest. The air had definitely changed, thicker, harder to pull into lungs. Not critical yet, but beginning its slow failure. She wondered how it worked. Would she simply fall asleep? Would her body fight at the end? Would instinct override acceptance? Part of her hoped for struggle, for the animal panic that proved life still mattered. Part of her craved the simplicity of surrender, of letting go without battle. Both parts would get their way eventually. She thought about the other Vestals, the ones who died here before. Had they found each other in the darkness? Had their ghosts made community of shared suffering? Or did death isolate as thoroughly as life had? Were they waiting for her past the black, ready to welcome the newest member to their buried sisterhood? Or was death just deeper darkness, just final silence, just the end of questions that never had answers? Her heartbeat seemed louder, echo in the earthen drum of her chest, counting out the time remaining. Each pulse a subtraction, each breath a smaller fraction. Mathematics of mortality. She'd calculated offerings for 30 years, measured oil for the eternal flame, counted out the proper proportions for sacred cakes. Now she calculated herself, estimated the hours, the minutes, the moments before numbers meant nothing. The stories would already be spreading, how she'd confessed on the cart, how she'd wept, how guilt had shown in every gesture. None of it true, all of it believed. Because Rome needed its narratives neat, needed its villains clear, needed its justice to seem just. They'd paint her as cautionary tale, as proof the system worked, as evidence the gods still watched and judged and punished. Future Vestals would learn her name as warning, would promise themselves more perfect purity, would think they could avoid her fate through fervent devotion, through absolute obedience, through being less human than she'd been. They'd learn too late what she'd learned. That innocence was just delayed guilt. That perfection was just postponed failure. That the only safety was in being too useful to sacrifice, until you weren't. The darkness had become familiar now, like an old cloak worn soft. She knew its weight, its texture, its patient presence. Strange comfort in that, in accepting what couldn't be changed, in embracing what had embraced her. She'd fought it at first, had raged against the dying light. Now she let it wrap around her, let it teach her its secrets, let it prepare her for whatever came next. Her hand found the wall again, still solid, still real, The earth hadn't collapsed, hadn't rushed to fill the space. The chamber held its shape, held her shape within it. Patient architecture of death, built to last longer than the bodies it contained. She wondered if archaeologists would find this place someday, would open ancient chambers, would puzzle over the bones, would invent new stories to explain old cruelties, would get it wrong in different ways. The rats had finished the bread, moved on to investigating her, tiny feet crossing her legs, whiskers brushing her hand, fearless in their domain. She remained still. Let them map her boundaries. Let them claim what they would. Everything belonged to them now. To them and the earth and the darkness that connected all things below. She'd joined their kingdom, had traded sunlight for citizenship in the underground. Consciousness flickered like the lamp had, bright moments between growing shadows. She saw the temple, saw her sisters performing morning ritual, saw the flame burning steady and indifferent. Then darkness reclaimed the vision, pulled her back to the present, to the only moment that existed in the black. She was here. She was now. She was ending. Everything else was dream or memory. Everything else was story told to avoid the truth. Her breathing had definitely changed. Shorter, shallower, the body protecting itself, rationing what air remained, stretching existence through conservation. Automatic wisdom of flesh that knew its business. That had done this before in countless bodies. That would do it again in countless more. She was just another vessel, another temporary container for processes older than Rome. The anger cooled, not gone, just banked like coals, waiting for breath to feed it. But breath was becoming precious. Too precious to waste on fury, too valuable to spend on what couldn't be changed. Let others carry the anger. Let the living burn with it. She had different work now. The work of letting go, of releasing holds she hadn't known she'd maintained, of becoming simple as earth, simple as darkness, simple as the end that waited patient as stone. Time folded in on itself, past and present collapsing into one eternal now. She was 6 years old, standing before the altar, was 36, lying in the dark, was every age between, was all the women who died here, was none of them, was everyone and no one. The boundaries that had defined her dissolved. The name they'd spoken at her trial meant nothing. The body they'd buried was just clay returning to clay. But something persisted, some spark that watched the dissolution, that noted each surrender, that refused to be buried quite yet. Call it soul, call it stubbornness, call it the last flame of a lifetime spent tending fires. It burned small but steady in the vast dark, burned without fuel, without air, without hope, burned because burning was what it knew, what it had always done, what it would do until even stubbornness failed. Her fingers found her throat, felt the pulse still moving there. Her finger, still pushing life through channels that led nowhere, still insisting on continuation without purpose. The body's mindless optimism, its refusal to read the obvious signs. She pressed gently, felt the rhythm steady under her touch, wondered if she could end it faster, if mercy lay in her own hands. But the fingers wouldn't close. The body wouldn't betray itself, would make death work for every moment. She thought she heard thunder, thought rain might be falling far above, washing the forum, cleaning the stones where she'd walked, erasing the last traces of her passage. Good. Let it all wash away. Let the city forget what it had done. Let the rain absolve everyone but the dead. She'd take their guilt into the ground, would hold it in her bones, would let it calcify into accusation that would outlast marble. The water on the floor had spread to surround her, made mud of the earth. She lay in it, felt it seeping through linen, felt it mixing with the clay she was becoming. Wet earth smelled different, smelled alive despite everything, smelled like spring planting, like possibility, like lies the ground told to seduce the living. But she was past seduction, past deception. She knew what earth really wanted, what it had always wanted, what it would eventually get from everyone. Another breath, harder one. The air had gone thin as mountain peak. She pulled it in anyway, held it, released it into the black. The exchange felt important, like prayer, like ritual, like the last ceremony she'd perform. Each breath, an offering. Each exhalation a release. She'd given 30 years to flame, could give a few hours to darkness, could feed this different hunger with the same dedication. The spark inside flickered, not dying, just changing, transforming from defiance to acceptance, from rage to recognition. She'd been faithful, had served perfectly, had done everything asked and more. The failure wasn't hers, had never been hers. She could let that truth warm her as flesh cooled, could carry that knowledge past the black, could release the guilt that had never belonged to her. Strange peace in that, in knowing she'd been right, in understanding that being right meant nothing in a world that needed convenient lies. But she'd know, would always know. Even when knowing ended, even when she joined the underground congregation, even when time forgot her name, she'd been faithful. The rest was Rome's sin, Rome's shame, Rome's slow suicide by murdered daughters. The rats returned, settled against her like she was landscape, like she'd already crossed from threat to furniture. She felt their small warmth, their quick heartbeats, their fearless company in the dark. They'd been here before her, would remain after, would remember in their small way, would carry stories in their blood of the woman who came to their kingdom, who shared their darkness, who joined their ancient democracy of the abandoned. Her eyes closed. Useless gesture in the black, but lids had their own weight, their own purpose. She let them fall, let them add their small darkness to the larger night. Behind them, she thought she saw light again. Not memory this time, not imagination, something else, something patient as the earth but kinder, something that might be ending, or beginning, or both at once. Another breath, the hardest yet, the air barely there, barely enough. But she took it, held it like she'd held the sacred flame, like she'd held all the precious things that broke, released it with something like prayer, something like forgiveness, not for them, never for them, but for herself, for the girl who'd believed, for the woman who'd served, for the faithful daughter Rome had thrown away. The spark inside steadied, burned clear, burned clean, ready for whatever came next. She felt herself becoming story, becoming earth, becoming part of the darkness that connected all forgotten things. Part of her wanted to fight, to rage, to refuse the ending they'd forced. But most of her was tired, was ready, was already gone. Only the watching remained, only the small consciousness noting each surrender, each system failing, each border dissolving. Time stopped meaning anything. Breath stopped meaning anything. The body made its own decisions now, continued or ceased according to rhythms older than thought. She floated in the space between sleeping and waking, between living and not, between the world above and the patience below. The threshold felt gentle, felt like coming home, felt like the first rest in 30 years. She thought of the eternal flame one last time, saw it burning steady in its bronze bowl, saw the shadows it threw, the light it made, the hope it represented. Had she ever believed in it? Really believed? Or had duty replaced faith so gradually she hadn't noticed? It didn't matter now. The flame would burn without her, would consume its offerings, would pretend to protect Rome, would fail when Rome needed it most, as Rome had failed her. The spark inside made its own light now, invisible, internal, perfect. Not the gaudy flame of temples, not the public fire of ceremony, just the small steady glow of truth held despite everything, of faith kept when faith meant nothing, of service given without hope of reward. That light didn't need air, didn't need fuel, didn't need anything but itself, would burn past the black, past the body, past the forgetting. A sound reached her, impossible sound, like bronze doors opening, like footsteps on marble, like all the ceremonies she'd performed, returning at once. But the chamber stayed sealed. The darkness remained absolute, just her mind making meaning from nothing, making memory from endings, making peace with what couldn't be changed. She let the sound wash over her, let it carry her toward whatever waited, let it be the last lie she'd believe. Her hand found her heart, felt it still moving, still trying, still faithful to its work. She pressed gently, gratefully, Let it know its service was seen, was honored, was almost complete. It had carried her through 30 years of ritual, through trials and accusations, through the last dark hours, had never failed, would fail only when she let it, when she gave permission, when she joined the patient earth. One more breath, thin as thread, but there, but taken, but released. The spark inside blazed brilliant, consumed itself in one perfect moment, showed her everything. The temple, the flame, her sisters, the city, all of it small as motes in vast darkness, all of it mattering less than the single truth she carried. She'd been faithful, had always been faithful, would be faithful past the end. Then the spark went out, gently, simply, like a flame perfectly tended, perfectly released. The darkness rushed in to claim what had always been its own, what had only been borrowed, what Rome had thrown away. In the chamber beneath the Campus Sceleratus, silence deeper than earth settled. The rats investigated briefly, found nothing of interest, returned to their darkness. Above, the eternal flame burned on, tended by other hands, fed by other lives, pretending nothing had changed. But in the buried dark, everything had changed. Another innocent added to the foundation, another sacrifice to appetites that would never be satisfied, another crack in the empire that thought it could murder its daughters and survive. The patient earth received her, held her, made her part of its long memory, part of its slow judgment, part of the bill that would come due. Rome would last another 3 centuries. The Vestals would tend their flame for 4, but the seeds of ending were already planted, growing in dark places, fed by innocent blood, watered by mothers' tears. Every buried daughter weakened the foundations, every murdered innocent hastened the collapse. The gods had long memories, had patient anger, had ways of collecting debts. When the barbarians finally broke the gates, when the eternal flame finally died, when the last Vestal walked away from cold ashes, perhaps someone remembered the women buried alive. The daughters sacrificed to fear, the faithful servants murdered for convenience, but probably not. History preferred its lies clean, its villains clear, its stories simple. In the Forum today, tourists walk over the spot where Cornelia's cart stopped, where she stepped down to earth, where she began her last journey. They take pictures of the ruins, buy souvenirs, learn sanitized versions of sanitized stories. The guide mentions the Vestal Virgins, their privileges, their importance, sometimes, if pressed, their fate when accused. But names get lost, details soften, truth becomes, tale becomes nothing. The Campus Sceleratus lies beneath modern buildings, paved over, built upon, forgotten. Somewhere in that earth, bones wait, patient as stone, silent as the darkness that claimed them. They don't need monuments, don't need remembering. They have something better. They have truth, have innocence that outlasts guilt, have faithfulness that survives faithlessness, have the long view that watches empires rise and fall again. Each time they bury women, each time they forget, each time they act surprised when the foundations crack. And somewhere beneath modern Rome, in chambers long collapsed, lie the bones of women who kept the sacred flame burning until Rome buried them in darkness for sins they never committed.